For thousands of years, the human story seemed to move in one direction. Larger populations spread across continents, while smaller human groups slowly disappeared into silence. Yet on one isolated island, a different kind of human may have survived far longer than anyone once believed. Living quietly while the rest of the world changed around them, their survival raises a disturbing possibility. Evolution does not always erase the vulnerable first. Sometimes it forgets them last. What happened to the strange human species that survived on an island until 12,000 years ago, long before cities, borders, or written memory? The shape of the world was very different from the maps people know today. During the colder ages of prehistory, vast amounts of water were trapped inside enormous glaciers covering northern regions of the planet. Sea levels were lower, sometimes exposing land between islands that are now separated by deep water. Early humans moving through these regions would not have seen the same coastlines visible today. Many shorelines stretched farther outward, and some islands stood closer together than they do now. Yet even during those colder periods, certain islands remained isolated by deep ocean channels that could not easily be crossed by animals or humans. One of those islands would eventually become connected to a strange chapter in human evolution. The isolation came first. Before scientists discovered bones or stone tools, geography had already shaped the lives of the people who lived there for thousands of years. The island existed within a region of dense forests, volcanic mountains, heavy rainfall, and unstable ground. Earthquakes and eruptions repeatedly changed the environment over long stretches of time. Rivers shifted direction, forests expanded and retreated. Coastlines slowly moved as the climate warmed and cooled across generations. Human communities living there would have experienced a world that never stayed completely still. Unlike large continents where populations could move across enormous distances, island life created limits. Water separated people from neighboring lands, reducing contact with outside groups and slowing the exchange of genes, tools, and ideas. Over many generations, this isolation could begin shaping a population in unusual ways. Scientists see similar patterns throughout the natural world. Large animals living on islands often become smaller over time because food sources are limited. Maintaining a large body requires constant energy, and small islands cannot always support enormous creatures. This process, sometimes called island dwarfism, affected many species in prehistoric environments. Fossil evidence from different islands shows elephants becoming smaller, predators disappearing, and ecosystems adjusting to confined spaces. Humans were never fully separate from these evolutionary pressures. The island connected to this mystery may have influenced the human body itself through long periods of separation and environmental limitation. This possibility became especially important after researchers began examining unusual human remains discovered there many thousands of years later. The region surrounding the island also occupied an important place in the wider story of human migration. Long before recorded history, human populations gradually moved outward from Africa into Asia and beyond. Some groups followed coastlines, while others adapted to forests, plains, or colder northern regions. Movement happened slowly across generations rather than through sudden journeys. People searched for food, safer climates, and stable environments where families could survive. Over immense stretches of time, humans eventually reached the island chains of Southeast Asia, yet this area contained a natural barrier unlike most others on Earth. Deep water channels separated ecosystems even when sea levels dropped during the Ice Age. Certain animals common in Asia never crossed into nearby islands, while species linked to Australia evolved separately on the other side. This boundary shaped animal life for countless generations. It also shaped human history. Reaching some islands may have required intentional movement across open water, even if the distances were shorter during colder periods. Scientists remain cautious about drawing conclusions from limited evidence, but the geography suggests that isolated island populations did not simply appear by accident again and again. Once humans arrived, separation from larger populations may have continued for very long periods. This matters because isolation changes more than location. It changes the rhythm of survival itself. Small populations are more vulnerable to storms, disease, volcanic disasters, and shortages of food. At the same time, isolation can preserve ancient traits long after they disappear elsewhere. While larger human populations across Eurasia continued changing through migration and interaction, A smaller island population could follow a quieter evolutionary path, almost unnoticed by the rest of the world. Somewhere within that isolation, hidden beneath tropical soil and layers of stone, traces of an unfamiliar human story remained buried for thousands of years before anyone realized they were there. During the coldest ages of prehistory, the seas around Southeast Asia looked very different from the waters visible today. Large amounts of the planet's water remained trapped inside glaciers covering northern regions of Earth. Because of this, coastlines extended much farther outward, exposing plains and shallow land bridges that later disappeared beneath rising oceans. Rivers crossed areas now covered by sea. Forests spread across low coastal ground. Animals and humans could move through landscapes that no longer exist on modern maps. Yet even during these colder periods, not every island became connected to surrounding land. Some remained separated by deep channels that stayed underwater regardless of how low sea levels fell. These waters created one of the most important natural boundaries in prehistoric human history. Scientists studying animal fossils across the region noticed something unusual long before strange human remains were discovered there. Certain large mammals common in mainland Asia appeared on some islands but vanished completely on others nearby. In the opposite direction, animals linked to Australia developed separately beyond the deeper ocean passages farther south and east. This pattern suggested that deep water prevented many species from crossing naturally for enormous stretches of time. The geography itself shaped evolution. Isolation created biological separation even between islands that appear close together on a modern globe. Humans entering this environment faced those same divisions. Reaching certain islands may have required crossing open water intentionally, even if the distances were shorter during Ice Age conditions. Researchers remain careful when discussing exactly how ancient humans travelled because direct evidence rarely survives in tropical climates. Wooden boats, simple rafts, or temporary floating structures decay quickly over thousands of years. Even so, the existence of human populations on isolated islands strongly suggests that some kind of deliberate crossing occurred at different moments in prehistory. This possibility changes the image many people hold about early humans. Ancient populations were not simply wandering across endless land without direction. In some regions, they adapted to coastlines, currents, and unstable island environments shaped constantly by rising and falling seas. Once a population reached an isolated island, separation from larger human groups may have lasted for thousands of years. Small populations living within confined environments often develop differently over time. Food sources remain limited compared to continents. Storms, droughts, volcanic eruptions, or disease can affect entire communities at once. Contact with neighboring populations may become rare or disappear completely for long periods. Isolation changes not only movement, but also the pace of biological change across generations. Scientists observe similar evolutionary patterns throughout the natural world, and statistically, on islands, large animals frequently become smaller because limited environments cannot support enormous bodies requiring constant energy. Fossil evidence from multiple prehistoric islands shows elephants shrinking in size over many generations. Predators sometimes disappear entirely when ecosystems become too small to support them. Humans were not removed from these pressures. A small human population surviving on an isolated island may also change gradually under environmental limitations lasting thousands of years. This idea later became central to understanding the unusual human remains eventually discovered there. The tropical climate also shaped what survived into the present for archaeologists to study. In colder regions, bones can remain preserved for extremely long periods beneath dry soil or frozen ground. Tropical forests are far less forgiving. Heat, moisture, roots, insects, and acidic earth slowly break down organic material until little remains. Entire human populations may disappear from the archaeological record almost completely. This is why the human story in island Southeast Asia often survives only in fragments: a few teeth, broken bones, scattered stone tools buried beneath cave sediment or volcanic ash. Scientists must reconstruct thousands of years of history from these small pieces. Long before unusual human fossils were identified, the island already contained the conditions necessary for deep isolation. Water-limited movement, population sizes remained small, forests and mountains narrowed the space where humans could live. Far away, other human groups spread across larger continents and continued changing through migration and exchange. Meanwhile, somewhere within these islands, another branch of humanity may have continued surviving quietly, while the rest of the human world evolved in different directions. For most of modern history, the island appeared ordinary to the outside world. Dense forests covered much of the landscape. Volcanic mountains rose above humid valleys, and seasonal rains slowly reshaped the ground year after year. Villages existed there long before archaeologists arrived, but the deeper past of the island remained almost invisible beneath layers of soil, stone, and cave sediment. Unlike ancient cities built from massive structures, prehistoric island populations often left behind very little that could survive into the present. Wood decays, plant fibers disappear, bones break apart in tropical heat and moisture. Entire generations can pass without leaving enough evidence for future humans to understand who once lived there. This silence in the archaeological record became one of the most important parts of the mystery itself. Scientists studying human origins have long understood that survival in prehistory depended heavily on geography. Large connected continents allowed populations to expand, mix, and exchange knowledge across enormous distances. Islands created different conditions. Isolation reduced movement and limited population size. In some cases, it also protected ancient populations from pressures affecting the outside world. Diseases spread more slowly, competition remained localized. Environmental changes arrived differently than they did across large continental regions. Isolation could become both a shield and a trap at the same time. A population might survive quietly for thousands of years while remaining extremely vulnerable to sudden disruption. The island connected to this story may have preserved one of these isolated human branches far longer than expected. This possibility matters because the human story was once far more diverse than it appears today. Modern humans are the only surviving human species now, but for long stretches of prehistory, different human groups existed across various parts of the world. Some adapted to colder northern climates. Others survived in forests, grasslands, or mountainous regions. Certain populations disappeared long before written history began, leaving only scattered bones and fragments of DNA behind. Scientists continue debating exactly how these groups interacted, and how long some survived because the evidence remains incomplete. Tropical islands create even greater uncertainty. The climate destroys evidence quickly, and rising sea levels may have submerged ancient coastal settlements beneath the ocean. Many traces of prehistoric life could remain permanently hidden underwater or erased entirely by time. Because of this, each discovery in isolated island regions carries unusual importance. A single cave layer can reshape entire theories about migration, evolution, and survival. Before researchers uncovered the strange human remains associated with this island, many assumptions about prehistoric human distribution seemed relatively stable. Ancient human populations were believed to follow broad migration patterns outward from Africa into Eurasia and eventually toward Australia. Yet, isolated islands suggested a more complicated reality. Some populations may have become separated early and survived independently for immense stretches of time. Others may have disappeared without leaving enough evidence to reconstruct their history clearly. The island itself preserved these uncertainties in silence for thousands of years. Forest growth covered ancient ground. Volcanic activity buried older surfaces beneath ash and sediment. Seasonal flooding shifted layers of earth inside caves, where traces of human activity sometimes remained hidden. Archaeologists entering such environments often work slowly and cautiously, because the evidence is fragile. A small mistake during excavation can destroy information that survived tens of thousands of years underground. Even when discoveries occur, interpretation remains difficult. A broken bone alone cannot explain language, culture, or social life. Scientists must avoid filling gaps with imagination unsupported by evidence. This caution became especially important once researchers began examining remains that appeared unlike those of modern humans. At first, the discoveries raised more questions than answers. Were the bones evidence of disease within ordinary human populations? Were they the remains of isolated individuals with unusual physical conditions? Or did they belong to a separate branch of humanity, shaped by island isolation over countless generations? The island offered no clear explanation immediately, Instead, it preserved fragments scattered across time, forcing scientists to rebuild the story piece by piece. Long before conclusions emerged, one reality already stood clear. Human history was not a simple straight line moving steadily toward the modern world. In isolated places surrounded by water and time, older human stories may have continued quietly long after the rest of the world had changed beyond recognition. In the early years of modern archaeological research on the island, no one expected to uncover evidence connected to a different kind of human. Most excavations in the region focused on migration routes, ancient animal remains, and the spread of early modern humans through Southeast Asia. The tropical environment had already destroyed countless traces of the distant past, so expectations remained cautious. Researchers often worked with only small fragments of bone, scattered stone tools, and layers of sediment buried deep inside caves. Yet caves mattered because they protected fragile material from rain, sunlight, and erosion better than open ground. Over thousands of years, dust, ash, animal remains, and signs of human activity slowly accumulated inside these enclosed spaces, creating layered records of prehistoric life. One cave on the island would eventually become central to a discovery that challenged assumptions about recent human evolution. The cave itself appeared unremarkable from the outside. Dense vegetation surrounded the entrance, and the humid tropical air shaped every surface inside. Excavation moved slowly because archaeological work in caves requires extreme care. Each layer of earth may belong to a completely different period separated by thousands of years. Removing material too quickly can destroy the timeline researchers are trying to reconstruct. Scientists carefully documented soil changes, volcanic ash deposits, animal bones, charcoal fragments, and stone tools while moving deeper into older layers of sediment. At first, the findings resembled many other prehistoric cave sites in Southeast Asia. Stone tools suggested repeated human activity over long periods. Animal remains hinted at hunting and survival within a changing island environment. Nothing immediately announced the presence of a previously unknown human population. Then researchers began uncovering skeletal remains that appeared unusual. Some bones seemed remarkably small compared to those of modern humans. The proportions did not fit comfortably within expectations for ordinary adult human skeletons. Initially, uncertainty surrounded the discovery. Scientists are trained to avoid dramatic conclusions based on limited evidence. Small body size alone does not prove the existence of a separate human species. Illness, nutritional stress, developmental disorders, or genetic conditions can also affect skeletal growth. Researchers understood that extraordinary claims required careful examination and comparison with known human remains from other regions. Even so, the bones continued raising difficult questions. The skull appeared unusually small. Certain features of the limbs and proportions differed from those commonly associated with modern humans living in recent prehistoric periods. The cave layers containing the remains also suggested significant age. Researchers gradually realized they might be looking at evidence of an isolated human population shaped by long evolutionary separation. The discovery immediately attracted intense scientific attention because it challenged a common assumption about human history. Many people imagine evolution as a straight path leading directly toward larger brains, more complex technology, and modern human dominance across the planet. The island remains suggested a more complicated reality. Different human populations may have adapted to local conditions in very different ways. Isolation on small islands could produce unexpected physical changes over immense stretches of time. Scientists studying the remains approached the evidence carefully because the implications were enormous. If the bones truly represented a separate human species surviving relatively recently in prehistory, then the human family tree remained more diverse much later than previously assumed. Yet caution remained essential. Researchers debated whether the skeleton belonged to a healthy adult from a small-bodied population or to an individual affected by medical conditions within an ordinary human group. Similar debates have appeared throughout the history of paleoanthropology whenever unusual fossils emerge. Bones alone rarely provide simple answers. Every feature must be compared against known variation within human populations, ancient and modern alike. Measurements, dating methods, and anatomical analysis all became central to the discussion surrounding the cave discoveries. Meanwhile, outside the scientific world, public fascination grew rapidly. The idea that a strange human population might have survived on an isolated island until relatively recent times captured widespread attention. Yet within archaeology, the atmosphere remained more restrained. Researchers understood how incomplete the evidence still was. Much of the prehistoric record had already vanished due to climate, erosion, and time. The cave preserved only fragments of a much larger story. Still, those fragments were enough to force an uncomfortable possibility into scientific discussion. Somewhere on this isolated island, another form of human may have survived quietly while modern human civilizations elsewhere were slowly beginning to reshape the world. As researchers continued studying the skeletal remains from the cave, the debate surrounding them became more intense. The bones did not fit neatly into familiar categories. Certain features resembled modern humans, while others appeared unexpectedly ancient or unusually proportioned. The skull was small compared to typical modern human skulls, yet the body proportions suggested an adult individual rather than a child. Scientists examining the remains had to consider multiple possibilities carefully, because unusual anatomy alone cannot immediately define a separate species. Human populations already show natural variation in height, bone structure, and physical development. Disease and developmental disorders can also produce skeletal differences that appear dramatic when viewed in isolation. Because of this, researchers approached the evidence cautiously, comparing the cave remains against both ancient human fossils and modern medical records. One of the most important questions involved body size. The skeleton appeared extremely small, even compared to many ancient human populations known for shorter stature. On isolated islands, limited food resources and environmental pressures sometimes influence body size over many generations. Scientists had already observed this pattern in animals from island ecosystems around the world. Fossil elephants on some islands became much smaller than their mainland relatives after long periods of isolation. Similar evolutionary pressures could potentially affect humans living in confined island environments for thousands of years. This idea became central to the discussion surrounding the cave remains. Some researchers argued that the small body and skull size reflected a long, isolated evolutionary history rather than disease. Others remained unconvinced and suggested that the skeleton may have belonged to a modern human with a medical condition affecting growth or brain development. The disagreement reflected a larger challenge within paleoanthropology itself. Fossils rarely arrive with complete context. Scientists must reconstruct entire populations and evolutionary relationships from incomplete remains often separated by enormous spans of time. A single skeleton cannot easily represent the full biological diversity of an ancient group. Researchers therefore examined every available detail closely: the shape of the jaw, proportions of the limbs, structure of the wrist bones, and form of the feet all became subjects of comparison. Some anatomical features appeared surprisingly primitive compared to recent modern humans. Others resembled traits seen in much older human relatives from distant periods of prehistory. The mixture complicated attempts to place the remains neatly within the known human family tree. Dating evidence added another layer to the debate. The cave sediments suggested that the population may have survived much later than many scientists once expected for non-modern human groups. Researchers remained cautious because dating methods in cave environments can become difficult when layers shift over time through water movement, animal activity, or geological disturbance. Even small changes in sediment layers can affect interpretations about age. Still, the possibility that an isolated human population survived until relatively recent prehistoric times forced scientists to reconsider how uneven human evolution may have been across different regions of the world. Evolution does not move at the same speed everywhere. Some populations remain connected through migration and exchange, while others become isolated for long periods. Islands intensify that separation. Small populations adapt to limited environments, often following biological paths different from larger continental groups. This may explain why the cave remains seemed both familiar and deeply unusual at the same time. The body belonged clearly to a member of the human family, yet not comfortably to any population scientists fully understood. Public attention surrounding the discovery grew quickly once images and descriptions of the remains reached international audiences. Many reports simplified the findings into dramatic headlines about a hidden species or a lost human world surviving in isolation. Within the scientific community, however, the atmosphere remained slower and more restrained. Researchers understood how easily speculation could move beyond the evidence itself. Much about the population remained unknown. Scientists could not confidently describe language, behavior, beliefs, or social organization from skeletal remains alone. The bones revealed anatomy, not complete lives. Even so, one conclusion became increasingly difficult to ignore. The human story was more complicated than a single straight line leading inevitably toward modern humanity. On this isolated island, another branch of the human family may have endured quietly for far longer than many researchers once believed possible. The more scientists examined the cave remains, the more difficult it became to explain them as ordinary modern humans. Individual bones continued revealing combinations of features rarely seen together in recent human populations. The feet appeared proportionally large compared to the body. Certain wrist bones resembled forms associated with much older human relatives rather than modern people. The shoulders, jaw structure, and limb proportions added further complexity to the discussion. None of these traits alone proved the existence of a separate human species. Together, however, they created a pattern that researchers could not easily dismiss. The island itself remained central to understanding why such unusual anatomy might appear there. Long periods of isolation can shape populations in unexpected ways, especially when small groups remain separated from larger human communities across many generations. Scientists comparing the remains with known human fossils from Africa, Europe, and Asia noticed something especially unsettling. Some anatomical features seemed ancient, almost as if certain traits from much older human populations had persisted far longer on the island than elsewhere in the world. This did not mean the population was unchanged or frozen in time. Evolution never completely stops. Instead, isolated environments may preserve older biological patterns while also producing new adaptations shaped by local conditions. The island population appeared to reflect both processes at once. Researchers gradually proposed that the remains belonged to a distinct human species adapted to island life over immense stretches of time. This interpretation remained controversial because it carried major implications for understanding human evolution. For much of the 20th century, human history was often described as a relatively orderly sequence leading toward modern humans. Earlier human groups appeared, spread, and disappeared, before later populations replaced them. The cave remains suggested a far less simple picture. Different human branches may have survived simultaneously in separate regions long after scientists once assumed they were gone. Isolated islands, especially, may have acted as refuges where small populations continued surviving quietly beyond the view of the larger prehistoric world. Dating evidence became critically important in this discussion. Researchers studied cave sediments, volcanic layers, and associated materials to estimate the age of the remains. Although debates continued regarding precise timelines, many scientists agreed that the population survived surprisingly late in prehistory, compared to earlier expectations for non-modern human groups. This possibility transformed the island from an obscure archaeological site into one of the most important locations in discussions about human diversity and survival. The idea that another human species may have existed until relatively recent times forced people to reconsider how incomplete the human story still remains. At the same time, caution remained essential. Paleoanthropology is filled with debates that evolved over decades as new discoveries appeared. Scientists understood that extraordinary claims required constant testing against new evidence. Some researchers continued arguing that the remains represented unusual modern humans affected by developmental conditions rather than a separate species. Others pointed to the consistent anatomical patterns across multiple bones as evidence of a stable, isolated population rather than isolated illness. The disagreement itself reflected the limits of the fossil record. Tropical climates destroy evidence rapidly, and the cave preserved only fragments of a much larger human history that may never be fully recovered. Beyond anatomy, the discovery also raised deeper questions about survival. If this island population truly represented a separate human species, how did it persist for so long in isolation? Small populations face enormous risks over time. Storms, volcanic eruptions, food shortages, disease, and simple genetic vulnerability can gradually weaken isolated communities. Yet isolation can also protect populations from competition and large-scale disruptions affecting continental regions. While modern humans spread across vast areas of Eurasia, an isolated island population may have continued surviving quietly within a smaller ecological world shaped by forests, coastlines, and changing seas. The remains did not provide complete answers. They offered only fragments: a skull, teeth, bones buried beneath layers of sediment and volcanic ash. Scientists could measure anatomy and estimate age, but much of daily life remained invisible. No written records existed. No stories survived from the population itself. Even so, the cave discoveries forced a difficult realization into modern science. Human evolution was not a clean progression toward a single final form. For thousands of years, different kinds of humans may have shared the Earth together, separated by geography, climate, and time, while barely knowing the others existed at all. One of the most striking features of the island remains was the size of the body itself. The skeleton appeared far smaller than most modern human bodies, even compared with populations known historically for shorter average height. Researchers examining the bones estimated that the individual stood at a height much lower than what many people would expect from a prehistoric adult human, yet the proportions of the skeleton suggested maturity rather than childhood. The teeth showed signs associated with adulthood, and the bones themselves did not resemble those of a growing child. This combination immediately forced scientists to confront an uncomfortable possibility. If the remains truly belonged to a healthy adult from an isolated population, then human evolution had produced a body form very different from the one most people imagine when thinking about prehistoric humans. The discovery challenged a common assumption that human evolution always moved toward larger brains, taller bodies, and increasingly complex physical development. Nature does not follow a single direction. Evolution responds to pressure, survival, environment, and time. On islands especially, biological change can move along unexpected paths. Scientists had already observed this pattern repeatedly in animals living within isolated ecosystems. Large mammals often became smaller after many generations because islands limited available food and territory. Smaller bodies required less energy and adapted more efficiently to environments where resources remained scarce or unpredictable. Fossil elephants from certain islands showed dramatic reductions in size compared with their mainland relatives. Similar changes affected other species as well. The isolated human population from this island may have experienced related pressures over immense spans of time. Food availability likely shaped every aspect of survival there. Tropical islands can appear abundant from a distance, filled with forests, rain, and coastal life. Yet dense forests do not always provide stable nutrition for large populations. Hunting opportunities fluctuate. Seasonal storms disrupt coastlines and vegetation. Small islands cannot support enormous herds of large mammals, like those found across continental grasslands during parts of prehistory. Human communities living in such environments often remain relatively small and dispersed. Over thousands of years, environmental limitation itself may begin influencing the body. Scientists studying the remains proposed that smaller stature could represent an adaptation shaped gradually through long isolation, rather than sudden illness or deformity. The skull became another major focus of discussion. Its internal volume appeared much smaller than that of modern humans. Public attention quickly centered on this feature because modern societies often associate brain size with intelligence, technology, and survival ability. Researchers approached the issue more carefully. Brain size alone does not directly explain the full range of cognitive behavior within ancient populations. Different species throughout evolutionary history survived successfully with varying brain structures shaped by their environments and ways of life. The island population survived long enough to adapt successfully to local conditions, whatever those conditions may have required. Archaeological evidence from the cave suggested the use of stone tools and controlled interaction with the surrounding environment. Scientists therefore avoided simplistic conclusions based entirely on skull size. The body proportions themselves also appeared unusual. The feet seemed relatively large compared to the short legs. Certain limb proportions differed from those commonly seen in recent modern humans. Some researchers noted similarities between aspects of the skeleton and far older human relatives from earlier stages of prehistory. This mixture complicated attempts to place the island population neatly within familiar categories. The remains looked both human and unfamiliar at the same time. Isolation may help explain part of this pattern. Small, separated populations often preserve combinations of traits that disappear elsewhere through larger-scale mixing and migration. Islands slow those exchanges. Over immense stretches of time, isolated groups may follow biological paths shaped more by local survival pressures than by wider human developments occurring elsewhere. While continental human populations interacted across broad regions of Eurasia, the island population remained confined within forests, caves, volcanic landscapes, and shifting coastlines surrounded by dangerous water. The body that eventually emerged from this isolation reflected that environment. It was not simply smaller than expected. It represented a different balance between energy, movement, survival, and adaptation shaped by a world far removed from the larger human migrations transforming other parts of the planet. The bones revealed that human evolution did not unfold identically everywhere. In some forgotten corners of the prehistoric world, isolation itself may have quietly reshaped what it meant to be human. Scientists studying isolated ecosystems have long noticed that islands often reshape living bodies in unusual ways. Animals arriving from large continents do not remain exactly the same after thousands of years in confined environments. Large species frequently become smaller, while some smaller species grow larger in the absence of predators. This pattern appears so often in the fossil record that researchers eventually recognized it as a recurring evolutionary process rather than a rare accident. The island connected to this human mystery showed signs of the same pressures. Fossil evidence from the region revealed animals that had changed dramatically in size compared with their mainland relatives. Small-bodied elephants once lived there, adapted to limited resources and restricted territory. The existence of these animals strengthened the argument that long isolation could also influence human populations living under similar environmental conditions. Human evolution does not stand outside nature. The body responds to survival pressures just as other species do. On large continents, human groups often remained connected through movement, trade, migration, and intermarriage across enormous distances. These connections allowed genes and cultural practices to spread continuously between populations. Islands interrupt that process. Water creates separation that may last for thousands of years. Small, isolated communities become more vulnerable to local environmental pressures because there are fewer opportunities for outside contact or population replacement. Over many generations, traits that would remain rare elsewhere may become common within confined populations. Scientists examining the island remains considered whether reduced body size could represent one of these long-term adaptations. A smaller body requires less food and energy to survive. In environments where resources fluctuate unpredictably, lower energy demands may provide advantages across generations. Dense tropical forests also shape movement differently from open plains. Travel becomes slower and visibility more limited. Small-bodied populations may adapt more efficiently to such environments over time, though researchers remain cautious about assigning direct causes too confidently. Prehistoric ecosystems are difficult to reconstruct fully, especially in tropical regions where organic evidence disappears quickly. Much about the daily lives of the island population remains uncertain. Still, the biological pattern itself fits broader evolutionary processes observed elsewhere in nature. The skeleton's proportions added complexity to this discussion. The body did not simply appear like a reduced modern human. Certain features seemed organized differently. The arms, shoulders, wrists, feet, and legs created combinations that scientists struggled to explain through ordinary variation alone. Some anatomical traits resembled much older human relatives known from earlier periods of evolution. Others appeared more closely connected to modern humans. The result was not a simple intermediate form between ancient and recent populations. Instead, the remains reflected a unique mixture shaped by deep isolation over immense stretches of time. This possibility forced researchers to reconsider assumptions about how human evolution unfolded across the world. Modern humans are now the only surviving human species, which creates the illusion that evolution naturally moved toward a single final outcome. The fossil record tells a more complicated story. Different human populations adapted to very different environments over long periods. Some survived in cold northern climates, Others adapted to forests, deserts, or mountainous regions. Island populations may have followed especially unusual evolutionary paths because isolation intensified environmental pressures while reducing contact with larger human groups. The island remains suggested that human diversity persisted much longer and in more varied forms than many earlier models proposed. At the same time, scientists remained careful not to oversimplify the role of island dwarfism itself. Evolution rarely follows a single rule. Not every small-bodied population results from the same pressures, and body size alone cannot define a separate species. Researchers continued comparing the remains against both ancient fossils and modern human medical conditions to avoid conclusions unsupported by evidence. Debate remained part of the scientific process. Yet even within that caution, one reality became increasingly difficult to ignore. The island population appeared shaped by long-term separation from the wider human world. Their bodies reflected an environment of limited space, unstable resources, and generations lived within a confined landscape surrounded by dangerous seas. Far beyond the island, larger human populations continued spreading across continents and reshaping prehistoric history. Meanwhile, this isolated branch of humanity may have continued surviving quietly in a biological world increasingly unlike that of any other human population on Earth. The longer scientists studied the island remains, the clearer it became that body size alone could not explain the population's uniqueness. The skeleton reflected an entire way of surviving within a confined environment shaped by water, forests, and long separation from larger human groups. Every part of the body carried clues about movement, energy use, and adaptation across generations. The legs appeared relatively short compared with the overall body proportions. The feet looked unusually large, creating a shape different from most modern human populations. Some researchers suggested that walking through uneven volcanic terrain, dense forest ground, and cave environments may have favored stable movement over long distances rather than speed across open landscapes. The island did not resemble the wide plains crossed by many prehistoric continental populations. Survival there likely depended on careful movement through narrow ecological spaces where resources remained limited and scattered. The shoulders and wrists added further mystery. Certain wrist bones resembled anatomical patterns associated with far older human relatives rather than recent modern humans. This detail became important because wrist structure affects flexibility, grip, and patterns of movement. Researchers debated whether these features reflected retained ancient traits, local adaptation, or a combination of both. Evolution does not erase every older characteristic at the same pace across all populations. Isolated groups sometimes preserve anatomical patterns that disappear elsewhere through migration and genetic mixing. On continents, large populations constantly exchange traits across regions. Islands interrupt that exchange. Over immense periods of isolation, unusual combinations may persist simply because the population remains separated from wider evolutionary trends affecting other humans. The skull remained one of the most discussed aspects of the discovery. Its small size attracted public fascination almost immediately, partly because modern culture often treats brain size as a direct measure of intelligence or complexity. Scientists approach the subject more carefully. Brain organization matters alongside size, and prehistoric survival depended heavily on environmental adaptation rather than modern technological standards. The island population survived long enough to maintain itself within a difficult ecosystem shaped by changing climates, volcanic instability, and restricted resources. Archaeological evidence from the cave suggested tool use and interaction with the surrounding environment over extended periods. Researchers therefore avoided simplistic claims that small brain size automatically meant primitive behavior or limited survival ability. Human evolution contains many examples of successful adaptation that do not fit modern assumptions about progress. The environment itself may explain much about why the body developed differently there. Small islands create narrow survival margins. Food shortages affect entire populations quickly. Natural disasters can isolate groups even further or reduce already small communities. In such conditions, bodies requiring less energy may provide long-term advantages. Smaller populations also experience genetic drift more strongly than large continental populations. Certain physical traits can become widespread simply because the community remains isolated over many generations. Scientists studying the remains recognize that the island population likely evolved under pressures very different from those affecting humans elsewhere in Eurasia during the same periods. While larger populations expanded across continents, exchanged technologies, and adapted to broad migration networks, the island group remained confined within a much smaller world. This isolation may have protected them for long periods. At the same time, it also created vulnerability. Small populations face constant risk from disease, environmental change, and declining genetic diversity. The body itself became part of that balance between survival and fragility. Every adaptation that helped preserve life within the island ecosystem may also have limited the population's ability to respond to sudden change. Scientists remain cautious about reconstructing too much from skeletal remains alone. Bones cannot reveal language, emotions, or complete social structures. Researchers avoid assigning detailed behaviors or beliefs without direct evidence. Even so, the anatomy reveals one important truth clearly. Human evolution was never uniform across the planet. Different branches of humanity responded to local environments in different ways, sometimes producing bodies that modern people would barely recognize as part of the same larger family. On this isolated island, separation, limited resources, and immense stretches of time appear to have shaped a human population unlike any surviving today. Their bodies carried the imprint of a world that existed apart from the larger flow of human history, hidden for thousands of years beneath tropical earth and volcanic stone. Life on a small prehistoric island followed a very different rhythm from life across large continents. There were no endless migration routes stretching toward distant horizons, and no vast herds moving across open plains in predictable seasonal patterns. The island limited movement in every direction. Forests, volcanic hills, caves, rivers, and steep coastlines shaped where humans could travel and where food could be found. For the isolated human population living there, survival likely depended less on expansion and more on careful balance with a confined environment that could not easily absorb sudden change. Scientists remain cautious about reconstructing daily life in detail because the evidence is incomplete, yet the geography itself reveals important limits that shaped existence across generations. Dense tropical forests covered much of the island landscape. Such environments provide food, but not always in stable or predictable amounts. Fruit appears seasonally. Small animals move through difficult terrain. Coastal resources shift with tides and storms. Hunting large mammals was probably far less common than in many continental ecosystems because islands support fewer large animal populations over long periods. Fossil evidence suggests that small-bodied elephants once existed in parts of the region, but island ecosystems rarely sustain the same abundance of large prey animals found across larger landmasses. Human groups living there likely survived through a combination of gathering, hunting smaller animals, exploiting coastal resources, and adapting constantly to changing local conditions. Population size itself may have remained small for thousands of years. Islands create natural limits on how many people the environment can support. Food shortages, storms, droughts, volcanic eruptions, and disease would affect isolated communities more severely than populations connected to broader migration networks. A failed season or environmental disruption could place enormous pressure on survival. Small groups often become highly vulnerable because there are fewer neighboring populations available for support or replacement. Scientists studying isolated human communities throughout history have repeatedly observed how fragile demographic balance can become when geography restricts movement and resources. The island population connected to this mystery likely lived within those same constraints across immense stretches of time. Caves may have played an important role in survival. Many archaeological discoveries from the island come from cave environments because caves preserve evidence better than exposed ground in tropical climates. For prehistoric humans, caves offered shelter from heavy rain, intense heat, and changing weather conditions. Some may have been occupied repeatedly across generations, while others served only temporarily during hunting or movement through difficult terrain. Inside caves, traces of fire, stone tools, animal bones, and sediment layers slowly accumulated over thousands of years. These fragments now provide some of the only surviving evidence of how the island population endured within its isolated world. Fire itself represented stability in an unstable environment. Controlled fire provides warmth, protection, cooking, and light inside enclosed spaces. Archaeological evidence from cave sites suggests repeated human occupation rather than brief accidental visits. This indicates long-term adaptation to island life rather than temporary survival by wandering groups. The population understood the environment well enough to persist there over very long periods despite ecological limitations. At the same time, their world remained physically small compared with the expanding human populations elsewhere during later prehistoric eras. On large continents, modern human groups gradually spread across enormous distances, adapting to deserts, plains, forests, and colder northern climates. Networks of movement connected populations across regions. Technologies and genetic traits circulated more widely. The island population existed apart from much of that process. Their survival depended not on expansion, but on endurance within confinement. Every generation inherited the same limited terrain surrounded by dangerous water. The sea protected them from some outside pressures while also preventing easy escape from local disasters or shortages. This isolation shaped not only the body, but likely the structure of life itself. Movement patterns, resource use, and social organization may all have adapted to the realities of living inside a restricted ecological space. Scientists avoid claiming certainty about details that evidence cannot fully support. No written records survive. No direct stories remain from the population itself. Yet the island environment still speaks through geography and biology. It reveals a human group surviving within narrow margins for immense spans of time, living quietly in a world shaped less by conquest or expansion than by careful adaptation to limits imposed by nature itself. For an isolated human population living on a small island, survival depended on understanding the environment in precise and practical ways. Large mistakes could become dangerous quickly because there were few opportunities to recover from failed hunting seasons, storms, or ecological disruption. The island offered protection through separation, but it also imposed constant limits. Food sources changed with rainfall, tides, and climate shifts. Forests could provide shelter and plant resources while also making movement slower and more difficult. Rivers and coastlines created opportunities for survival, yet they also changed over time as volcanic activity and seasonal flooding reshaped the land generation after generation. In such an environment, daily life was likely organized around careful adaptation rather than expansion into new territory. Scientists studying prehistoric island ecosystems often emphasize how unstable small environments can become over long periods. A continent contains many overlapping ecological zones. If one region becomes difficult, populations may migrate toward another. Islands reduce those options. Human groups living there must survive within a narrower range of resources and geographic space. This may help explain why the island population remained relatively small in body size. Smaller bodies require less food energy, which can become advantageous in environments where nutrition fluctuates unpredictably across seasons and years. Biological adaptation and environmental pressure likely shaped each other slowly over immense stretches of time. The tropical climate also affected patterns of movement and settlement. Dense vegetation limited visibility across large distances. Open grasslands suitable for tracking enormous herds were far less common than in some continental regions occupied by prehistoric humans. Hunting probably focused more on smaller animals and localized opportunities. Gathering edible plants, shellfish, or coastal resources may have played an important role as well, though researchers remain careful not to reconstruct exact diets without sufficient evidence. Archaeological remains from tropical islands are often incomplete because heat, moisture, and acidic soil destroy organic material rapidly. Even so, surviving animal bones and stone tools suggest repeated interaction with the surrounding environment rather than brief occupation. The sea itself shaped life constantly. Rising and falling coastlines changed access to fishing grounds, caves, and movement routes over thousands of years. During colder periods, lower sea levels exposed more coastal land. During warmer periods, the ocean advanced inward again, flooding earlier landscapes. Entire areas where prehistoric humans may once have lived now lie underwater beyond the reach of ordinary excavation. Scientists suspect that many traces of ancient island populations disappeared beneath the sea after the Ice Age ended and global water levels rose. This means the surviving archaeological record may represent only a small fragment of the population's full history. Isolation affected social survival as much as physical survival. Small populations face demographic risks that larger groups can absorb more easily. Disease outbreaks, accidents, declining fertility, or environmental disasters can reduce numbers rapidly. Over long periods, isolated groups may struggle to maintain stable population diversity. Researchers studying prehistoric human survival recognize that extinction does not always require violence or catastrophe. Sometimes populations simply become too small to sustain themselves across generations. The island population likely lived close to those demographic limits for much of its existence. Yet despite this fragility, they survived for remarkably long periods within their confined world. This endurance suggests deep familiarity with the environment and long adaptation to local ecological rhythms. The archaeological evidence also hints at continuity rather than chaos. Stone tools discovered in cave layers indicate repeated technological behavior over time. These tools were not highly elaborate by later human standards, but complexity alone does not define successful adaptation. Simple technologies can remain effective for thousands of years when they match environmental needs closely. The island population survived not by transforming the landscape dramatically, but by fitting within its constraints. This distinction matters because modern people often imagine human progress only through expansion, growth, and increasing technological complexity. The island story suggests another possibility. Survival sometimes depends on stability rather than constant advancement. While larger human populations elsewhere reshaped wider regions through migration and cultural exchange, this isolated branch of humanity may have persisted quietly through restraint, adaptation, and intimate knowledge of a very small world surrounded by water and time. The longer a human population remains isolated on a small island, the more survival begins to depend on balance rather than growth. Every resource carries limits. Forest animals reproduce slowly. Coastal food sources change with storms and tides. Fresh water depends on rainfall and seasonal stability. A population living within such an environment cannot expand endlessly without increasing pressure on the land supporting it. Scientists studying island ecosystems often describe them as delicate systems where even small disruptions can create long-term consequences. The isolated human population connected to this island mystery likely lived within those limits for thousands of years. Their survival may have depended not on conquering nature, but on remaining closely tied to its rhythms. Small populations also experience time differently from large continental societies. On continents, human groups frequently encounter outsiders, exchange tools, migrate across wide territories, and absorb new ideas over generations. Islands reduce these interactions. Life becomes centered around familiar landscapes repeated across lifetimes. The same coastlines, the same caves, the same forest paths moving through volcanic terrain and tropical rain. Over immense spans of time, this creates a human existence shaped more by continuity than rapid transformation. Archaeological evidence from the island suggests repeated occupation of certain areas rather than constant movement outward into expanding territory. This pattern fits the environmental realities of island survival. The body itself likely reflected this restricted world. Smaller stature reduced energy demands in ecosystems where food could become unpredictable. Limited movement across confined landscapes may have shaped physical adaptation differently from populations traveling enormous continental distances. Scientists remain cautious about connecting specific anatomical features directly to behavior, yet the broader evolutionary pattern remains consistent with long-term isolation. Human bodies adapt to environments gradually through generations, especially when populations remain separated from larger networks of migration and exchange. The island population appears to have carried those biological consequences deeply within its structure. At the same time, isolation creates vulnerability beneath apparent stability. A small community can survive quietly for centuries while remaining fragile in ways invisible from the outside. Volcanic eruptions may suddenly destroy hunting grounds or freshwater sources. Climate changes can alter coastlines and food availability across generations. Rising sea levels after the Ice Age likely transformed large parts of the island environment itself. Coastal plains where earlier populations may have traveled or gathered resources slowly disappeared beneath advancing water. Human groups living there would have been forced to adapt repeatedly as familiar landscapes changed around them. Scientists suspect that many prehistoric island settlements now lie underwater, permanently hidden beneath modern seas. This loss shapes the archaeological record today. Much of the island population's history may simply no longer exist in recoverable form. Yet enough survived to reveal one important reality. The population endured environmental instability for an extraordinarily long time. Their survival was not brief or accidental. They adapted repeatedly to isolation, shifting coastlines, and restricted ecological space while much of the wider human world changed elsewhere. During periods when modern human populations expanded across Eurasia, developed new technologies, and entered increasingly complex migration networks, this island group appears to have continued living within a much smaller environmental world. Their story unfolded at a quieter scale, almost entirely separated from the larger movements shaping prehistoric humanity beyond the sea. Scientists avoid romanticizing this survival because isolation was not necessarily peaceful or easy. Small populations often face harsh conditions invisible in the limited archaeological record. Injury, illness, hunger, and environmental pressure likely remained constant parts of existence. The evidence does not support fantasies of untouched paradise or perfect harmony with nature. Instead, the island reveals something more restrained and more fragile. A human population survived there because it adapted carefully enough to endure within narrow ecological margins over immense periods of time. The caves, stone tools, bones, and scattered traces left behind all point toward persistence rather than dominance. This distinction matters deeply when thinking about human evolution. Modern societies often celebrate expansion, speed, and growth as signs of success. The island population followed another path entirely. Their existence suggests that survival in prehistory sometimes belonged not to the largest or strongest groups, but to those capable of remaining within the limits imposed by a small and isolated world surrounded by dangerous water on every side. Among the most important traces left behind by the island population were simple stone tools, scattered through cave layers and buried sediments. These objects survived because stone endures long after wood, fibers, and flesh disappear. In tropical environments especially, most organic materials decay rapidly beneath heat and moisture. Entire generations can vanish from the archaeological record with almost nothing remaining. Stone tools therefore become one of the few direct connections between modern researchers and prehistoric human activity. On this island, the tools revealed that the population did not merely survive passively within isolation. They interacted with their environment deliberately, shaping objects for cutting, scraping, processing food, and possibly hunting small animals. The tools themselves were not highly elaborate compared with technologies developed later by larger human populations elsewhere. Yet simplicity should not be mistaken for failure or lack of adaptation. A tool survives when it matches the needs of the environment where it is used. Scientists studying prehistoric technology often warn against measuring all ancient populations according to modern ideas of progress. Complex tools are not automatically necessary for survival in every ecological setting. The island population lived within a confined world of forests, caves, rivers, and changing coastlines. Their survival depended less on technological expansion than on stable adaptation to local conditions over immense periods of time. The archaeological evidence suggests that simple stone technologies remained effective there for generations. Many of the stone tools discovered on the island appear shaped for practical tasks requiring durability rather than refinement. Sharp edges could process animal remains, cut plant material, or prepare food gathered from the surrounding environment. Some tools may have been used repeatedly while others served temporary purposes before being discarded. Researchers continue debating the exact behaviors connected to these artifacts because stone alone cannot fully reveal how prehistoric humans organized daily life. Even so, the repeated presence of tools across different cave layers indicates continuity. Human groups return to certain places again and again over long stretches of time. This pattern suggests familiarity with the landscape and long-term occupation rather than isolated accidental visits. Fire also appears to have played an important role in survival. Evidence of burning within cave sediments points toward controlled use of fire rather than random natural events alone. For prehistoric humans, fire transformed survival itself. It provided warmth, protection from predators, light within caves, and the ability to cook food. Cooking changes digestion by softening plant fibers and animal tissue, allowing the body to access nutrients more efficiently. In difficult environments where food resources fluctuate, this efficiency matters greatly. The island population may have depended heavily on controlled fire to stabilize survival within their confined ecological world. Caves offered natural spaces where fire could be maintained more safely during storms and heavy rain common in tropical climates. Scientists remain cautious about assigning advanced cultural interpretations to limited evidence. Archaeological remains reveal actions more clearly than beliefs or social structures. Yet repeated tool use and controlled fire strongly suggest organized behavior shaped by familiarity with the environment. Survival on the island required practical knowledge accumulated over generations. Human groups had to recognize edible plants, understand seasonal changes, move safely through volcanic terrain, and adapt to fluctuating coastal conditions. None of this required massive cities or advanced metallurgy. Prehistoric survival often depended more on consistency than innovation. The island population appears to have maintained that consistency for an extraordinarily long period. At the same time, their technological world remained relatively small compared with broader changes occurring elsewhere during later prehistory. Across parts of Eurasia, modern human populations gradually developed more varied tool industries, long-distance exchange networks, and increasingly specialized technologies. The island group remained largely outside those developments. Water separated them from larger migration systems and reduced contact with outside populations. Their tools therefore reflect continuity within isolation, rather than rapid technological transformation. This distinction matters because it reveals how differently human societies could evolve under different environmental conditions. The island population was not moving along the same historical path later followed by expanding civilizations. Their survival depended on maintaining practical adaptation within a limited ecological space surrounded by dangerous seas. The stone tools left behind now serve as quiet evidence of that long endurance. Small, simple, and easily overlooked, they remain among the few surviving objects linking modern humans to a vanished branch of humanity that once lived apart from the larger human world. The stone tools discovered on the island were modest in appearance, yet they carried enormous importance for understanding how the isolated human population survived. Unlike bones, which mainly reveal anatomy, tools provide evidence of repeated action. They show that prehistoric humans shaped the environment intentionally rather than simply reacting to it passively. Each chipped edge reflects decisions made by hands that disappeared thousands of years ago. Scientists studying the cave sites noticed that the tools appeared across multiple sediment layers, suggesting continued human presence over long periods rather than a single brief occupation. This continuity became especially important because it connected the unusual skeletal remains to sustained patterns of survival within the island environment. Most of the tools were relatively simple, compared with the highly specialized technologies developed later by larger human populations elsewhere. Sharp flakes and cutting implements dominated many of the archaeological layers. Researchers believe these objects may have been used for processing plants, preparing animal remains, cutting fibers, or carrying out daily survival tasks within forests and caves. The simplicity of the technology does not necessarily indicate limited intelligence or inability. Archaeologists repeatedly caution against treating technological complexity as a direct measure of human worth or cognitive capacity. Different environments reward different forms of adaptation. On a small island with restricted resources and relatively stable ecological patterns, durable and efficient tools may have remained useful for thousands of years without major redesign. This stability itself reveals something important about the island population. Their world changed slowly compared with regions shaped by constant migration and large-scale cultural exchange. The surrounding environment likely shaped how technology developed there. Dense forests reduce visibility and movement over long distances. Hunting large animals across open plains requires different tools than surviving within confined tropical landscapes. Small island populations often rely on flexible survival strategies rather than highly specialized technologies dependent on abundant resources. The archaeological evidence suggests that the island humans adapted closely to local conditions instead of pursuing technological expansion for its own sake. Their survival depended on maintaining a working balance with a limited environment rather than transforming it dramatically. Fire remained central to that balance. Evidence of burning found within cave sediments strongly suggests repeated controlled use rather than isolated natural accidents. Fire changes prehistoric survival in fundamental ways. It allows food preparation, extends activity into darkness, provides protection from predators, and creates stable gathering spaces within difficult environments. On tropical islands where heavy rain and humidity dominate much of the year, maintaining fire consistently requires knowledge, planning, and familiarity with local materials. Dry fuel must be located and protected. Sheltered spaces become valuable. The repeated presence of fire traces within caves suggests organized use of these environments over generations. Scientists cannot fully reconstruct the daily routines surrounding those fires, but the evidence indicates continuity rather than random occupation. The caves themselves likely served multiple purposes. Shelter from storms would have been important in a region shaped by seasonal rainfall and volcanic instability. Caves also provide stable temperatures and protection for stored materials or gathered food. Human groups returning repeatedly to the same cave spaces over long periods may have developed deep familiarity with the surrounding landscape. Movement routes, water sources, coastal access points, and seasonal changes would become part of accumulated survival knowledge passed across generations. No written language preserved these experiences, yet practical understanding of the environment likely formed the foundation of life on the island. At the same time, the archaeological record reveals limits alongside survival. The technology remained relatively localized and stable compared with broader prehistoric developments occurring elsewhere. Larger human populations across Eurasia gradually expanded exchange networks, diversified tool industries, and adapted to increasingly varied ecological zones. The island group remained largely separated from those processes. Water restricted movement and reduced sustained outside contact. Their tools therefore reflect endurance within isolation rather than participation in wider technological transformation. This distinction helps explain why the island population remained biologically and culturally unusual for so long. Their world operated according to the constraints of confinement, limited resources, and long separation from continental human history. The surviving stone tools now offer quiet evidence of that existence. Small fragments of shaped rock buried beneath tropical soil reveal a human population that endured not through expansion or conquest, but through repeated practical adaptation to a narrow world surrounded by sea and time. For modern people, it is easy to underestimate how much knowledge is hidden inside simple survival. A sharpened stone may appear primitive beside modern machines, yet in prehistoric environments, even basic tools represented accumulated understanding passed across generations. The isolated human population on the island survived within a difficult ecological world for immense spans of time. That endurance alone suggests practical adaptation sophisticated enough to maintain life despite limited resources, unstable climates, and long separation from larger human populations. The archaeological remains may appear modest, but they reveal consistency, and consistency matters deeply in human evolution. Every repeated survival strategy that continues across centuries becomes evidence of successful adjustment to local conditions. Scientists studying the cave sites noticed that the stone technologies changed relatively slowly over time. Unlike some prehistoric regions where tool industries transformed rapidly through migration and cultural exchange, the island record suggested long continuity. This pattern fits what researchers often observe in isolated environments. Small populations separated by water and geography experience fewer outside influences. Innovation may occur gradually, but broad technological revolutions spread more slowly when contact networks remain limited. The island population therefore appears to have maintained practical methods closely tied to the surrounding environment rather than constantly pursuing new forms of technology. This stability was not necessarily weakness. In confined ecosystems, survival often depends on reliability more than experimentation. The surrounding forests likely demanded intimate environmental knowledge. Tropical landscapes contain edible plants alongside poisonous ones. Animal behavior changes with rainfall, temperature, and seasonal shifts. Rivers rise unexpectedly during storms, and volcanic terrain creates unstable ground across certain regions. Human groups living there for thousands of years would have learned these patterns through direct experience repeated across generations. Scientists cannot reconstruct the exact details of how knowledge was shared within the population, but survival itself implies organized learning over long periods. Children born into the group would gradually absorb information about movement routes, food gathering, tool use, shelter, and changing coastal conditions simply by participating in daily life. Much of prehistoric human survival depended on memory, carried through observation and repetition rather than written systems or large-scale institutions. The island population may have preserved that kind of environmental memory for enormous stretches of time. Fire likely stood at the center of many of these routines. Beyond warmth and protection, fire changes social rhythm itself. It extends activity into darkness, creates gathering spaces, and stabilizes food preparation within difficult climates. Maintaining fire continuously in humid tropical environments requires effort and planning. Dry material must be collected and protected carefully from moisture. Caves would have provided safer conditions for preserving embers and sheltering flames during storms. Archaeological traces suggest repeated controlled use of fire rather than isolated accidental burning. This repeated pattern indicates long familiarity with managing difficult environmental conditions. At the same time, the island population remained vulnerable despite this adaptation. Simple technologies function effectively within stable ecological systems, but isolation limits flexibility when sudden disruption occurs. A volcanic eruption, climate shift, rising sea levels, or declining food sources could place enormous pressure on small populations already living near environmental limits. Larger continental human groups often survived such changes through migration into new regions or exchange with neighboring communities. Islands reduce those possibilities. The same isolation that protects populations from outside competition can also trap them within shrinking ecological space. Scientists suspect this tension shaped much of the island population's long history. Their survival depended on maintaining balance within narrow margins rather than expanding outward into larger territories. The stone tools and traces of fire left behind now appear almost quiet in comparison with later human civilizations filled with metal, cities, and written records. Yet these remains preserve evidence of another kind of human existence, one built not around rapid expansion or technological dominance, but around persistence within confinement. The island population survived because their knowledge matched the realities of their environment closely enough to endure across countless generations. Long after their bodies disappeared and their voices fell silent, the small fragments they left buried in caves still reveal a deeper truth about human evolution. Survival has never belonged only to the strongest or most advanced populations. Sometimes it belongs to those capable of adapting patiently to a small world that changes slowly around them. While the isolated island population continued surviving within its confined world, enormous changes were unfolding across the rest of prehistoric humanity. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, had already spread outward from Africa over many thousands of years, gradually moving into Asia, Europe, Australia, and eventually the Americas. These migrations did not happen as single organized events. They unfolded slowly across generations through movement along rivers, coastlines, forests, and open plains. Small groups adapted to new climates and environments as they traveled, carrying knowledge, tools, and biological traits into regions that earlier human populations had already occupied long before them. By the time modern humans reached parts of Southeast Asia, the human world may already have contained multiple branches of humanity living separately across different landscapes. The island connected to this mystery did not exist outside those broader movements forever. Sooner or later, modern human populations moving through the region likely approached the surrounding islands and coastlines. Scientists continue debating exactly when these encounters may have occurred because the archaeological evidence remains incomplete. Tropical climates destroy organic material rapidly, and rising sea levels after the Ice Age submerged many ancient coastal regions that early humans may once have used for travel and settlement. Even so, enough evidence survives to show that modern humans eventually spread widely across island Southeast Asia. This raises one of the most difficult questions surrounding the isolated island population. Did they survive entirely alone, or did different human groups exist near each other for a period of time before the island population disappeared? Researchers remain cautious when discussing direct interaction because no clear evidence currently proves sustained contact between the island humans and modern Homo sapiens. No written records exist. No preserved conversations, traditions, or cultural exchanges survived. The fossil evidence itself remains fragmentary, yet the possibility of overlapping existence continues shaping scientific discussion because the estimated age of the island remains appears surprisingly recent in evolutionary terms. If the dating evidence is broadly correct, then another branch of humanity may have persisted long after modern humans had already expanded across much of the planet. This possibility changes the emotional scale of the story. The island population was not disappearing in some distant, forgotten prehistoric age, completely separated from all other humans. They may have survived into a world where modern human populations were already spreading through neighboring regions, adapting to coastlines, forests, and island routes nearby. Geography likely played an important role in delaying contact. Deep ocean channels separated many islands even during periods of lower sea levels. Reaching isolated islands required movement across open water, whether through deliberate crossings or gradual coastal travel. Small, separated populations could therefore remain isolated for very long periods, despite broader migration occurring elsewhere around them. The sea acted both as barrier and protection. It limited movement, reduced outside competition, and preserved unusual evolutionary paths that may have disappeared more quickly on large connected continents. At the same time, isolation could not guarantee permanent survival forever. Modern human populations often expanded successfully into diverse environments because of flexible social structures, broader exchange networks, and technological adaptability. Researchers avoid simplistic claims that one human species simply defeated another through direct superiority. Human extinction is rarely explained by a single cause alone. Climate shifts, declining population size, disease, ecological instability, and competition for resources may all interact over long periods. Small, isolated populations remain especially vulnerable because they have fewer opportunities to recover from environmental disruption. The island humans may have lived close to those demographic limits for much of their history. Meanwhile, modern human groups entering surrounding regions likely carried different patterns of movement, cooperation, and environmental adaptation shaped by wider migration networks across Eurasia. Scientists continue studying archaeological layers, fossils, and ancient environments to understand how these timelines may have overlapped. Much remains uncertain. Yet one reality appears increasingly clear. For at least some period of prehistory, the Earth may not have belonged only to modern humans. Different branches of humanity may have existed simultaneously in separate ecological worlds, divided by geography and time while barely aware of each other's presence. On this island, surrounded by difficult seas, one of those branches appears to have endured quietly almost until the edge of the modern human age itself. As modern human populations continued expanding through Southeast Asia, the region became part of a wider network of prehistoric movement stretching across oceans, islands, and coastlines. Humans adapted to tropical forests, changing sea levels, and unfamiliar ecosystems while gradually spreading farther into territories that earlier human groups may already have occupied in isolation. Archaeological evidence from various islands suggests that modern humans developed increasing familiarity with coastal travel over long periods. Rivers, shorelines, and chains of islands created pathways connecting populations across distances that once seemed impossible to cross. Yet movement through these environments remained slow, uncertain, and deeply shaped by geography. Deep water channels still separated many islands from one another, preserving pockets of isolation even while migration expanded elsewhere around them. This uneven geography may explain how the isolated island population survived for so long without becoming fully absorbed into larger human networks. Scientists continue debating whether direct encounters between modern humans and the island population ever occurred. The evidence remains frustratingly incomplete. Fossils are rare, tropical climates destroy organic material quickly, and rising oceans after the Ice Age submerged many ancient coastal routes beneath water. Archaeologists therefore work with fragments rather than complete timelines. Even so, some dating evidence suggests that modern humans may already have been living in nearby regions while the isolated island population still survived on the island itself. If true, This would mean different kinds of humans shared parts of the world simultaneously, much later than earlier scientific models once assumed. The possibility changes how human prehistory is imagined. Rather than a simple sequence where one human group vanished before another appeared, the world may have contained overlapping human populations adapted to very different environments at the same time. Geography likely shaped the nature of any possible contact. The island population lived within a confined ecological world formed by forests, volcanic landscapes, caves, and dangerous surrounding seas. Modern human groups moving through the broader region may have occupied larger networks of islands and coastal territories connected through repeated migration and exchange. Small isolated populations often remain difficult to detect even within modern history, especially in dense tropical environments. In prehistory, separated by water and lacking written communication, entire human groups could exist remarkably close together, while maintaining little or no sustained interaction. Scientists therefore remain cautious about assuming regular contact simply because populations existed within the same broad region. At the same time, complete isolation may also be unlikely over immense stretches of time. Human groups move. Storms displace people unexpectedly. Coastal travel creates opportunities for accidental encounters. Resource shortages may push populations into unfamiliar territory. Even brief contact between different human groups could carry enormous consequences for small isolated communities. Competition for limited food resources, exposure to unfamiliar diseases, or demographic pressure from larger incoming populations may gradually destabilize smaller groups already living near ecological limits. Researchers studying prehistoric extinctions often emphasize that disappearance rarely results from one dramatic event alone. Small populations can decline slowly across generations until recovery becomes impossible. The island population may have faced exactly this kind of fragile long-term pressure. Modern humans themselves were changing rapidly during these periods. Across Eurasia and beyond, populations developed broader social networks, increasingly varied tools, and flexible strategies for surviving in different climates. These advantages did not make modern humans universally stronger in every environment, but they may have improved resilience during periods of environmental instability. Larger interconnected populations often recover more easily from local disasters because migration and exchange distribute risk across wider regions. Isolated island populations rarely possess that protection. Their survival depends heavily on local ecological balance remaining stable over long periods. Scientists cannot yet determine exactly how the island population disappeared. The archaeological record simply becomes quieter. Fossils remain scarce. Tool evidence grows thinner. The surviving traces suggest persistence followed eventually by absence, but the process itself remains largely hidden. No battlefield survives. No evidence of sudden destruction appears clearly in the cave layers. Instead, the silence of the island deepens. Somewhere within changing coastlines, shrinking ecological space, and the expanding presence of modern humans across surrounding regions, another branch of humanity may have slowly faded from the world without leaving enough evidence for anyone to fully witness how it happened. The possibility that modern humans and the isolated island population existed within the same wider region at roughly the same time creates one of the most unsettling ideas in human evolution. For most people, prehistory is imagined as a sequence of replacements. One human species disappears completely before another emerges to take its place. The archaeological evidence from this island suggests reality may have been far less orderly. Different branches of humanity may have survived simultaneously in separate ecological worlds divided by geography, climate, and distance. Some populations expanded across continents while others remained confined to forests, caves, and isolated islands surrounded by dangerous water. The Earth may once have contained multiple human stories unfolding quietly beside each other without ever fully merging. Scientists remain careful not to exaggerate what the evidence can support. No direct proof currently confirms regular interaction between the island population and modern humans. No shared settlements have been identified clearly. No written memory survives from either group describing contact. The fossil record remains incomplete, damaged by tropical climates, volcanic activity, erosion, and rising seas that submerged large parts of the prehistoric coastline after the Ice Age. Yet even within these limits, the possibility of coexistence changes how researchers think about the human past. It suggests that human diversity survived much longer than earlier scientific models once assumed. Geography remained central to this survival. Deep ocean channels protected the island from becoming fully absorbed into broader migration systems for immense stretches of time. Small populations isolated by water can persist quietly even while larger demographic changes reshape surrounding regions. The same forces that limited movement toward the island may also have delayed outside pressure from expanding modern human groups. Isolation slowed contact, preserved unusual biological traits, and allowed a distinct human population to continue surviving within its confined environment. At the same time, isolation also increased fragility. Small populations rarely possess large reserves of resilience when environments begin changing rapidly. The end of the Ice Age transformed coastlines across Southeast Asia. Rising sea levels flooded low plains and altered access to resources, caves, and movement routes. Forest patterns shifted with changing climates. Volcanic activity may have disrupted ecosystems repeatedly across generations. A population already living close to ecological limits could become vulnerable slowly without any single catastrophic event occurring. Modern humans spreading through surrounding regions may have intensified those pressures even without direct conflict. Researchers studying prehistoric extinctions often emphasize that disappearance can unfold gradually through overlapping causes. Competition for resources does not always require warfare. Small demographic shifts may reduce access to hunting territory or coastal food sources over time. Disease exposure can affect isolated populations severely because genetic diversity remains limited. Larger connected populations often recover more easily from environmental instability through migration and exchange with neighboring groups. Isolated island communities do not possess the same flexibility. Their survival depends heavily on local ecological balance remaining stable across generations. Once that balance weakens, decline may continue slowly until the population becomes too small to sustain itself. The archaeological silence following the island population's disappearance reflects this uncertainty. The fossils do not reveal a dramatic ending. No clear evidence points towards sudden violence or rapid destruction. Instead, the traces simply become fewer. Stone tools appear less frequently. Human remains disappear from later layers. Eventually, the record falls quiet altogether. This silence itself becomes part of the story. Entire branches of humanity may vanish without monuments, written history, or surviving cultural memory. Modern humans now stand as the only remaining human species, which creates the illusion that survival was inevitable. The island reminds scientists that this outcome was never guaranteed. For most of prehistory, humanity existed as a branching and uneven family spread across different environments. Some populations adapted successfully for immense stretches of time before disappearing completely. Others survived by chance, geography, flexibility, or demographic scale. The island population appears to have endured remarkably long within its isolated world, yet eventually, even that endurance reached its limit. Somewhere between rising seas, ecological pressure, shrinking population size, and the expanding presence of modern humans across surrounding regions, another form of humanity slowly disappeared from Earth. No one knows whether the final survivors understood they were becoming the last of their kind. The bones and stone tools left behind cannot answer that question. They only reveal that for a long time, humans were not alone in being human. One of the most difficult problems surrounding the island population is not simply who they were, but when they actually lived. Time in archaeology is rarely as precise as modern calendars suggest. Scientists do not uncover fossils with exact dates attached to them. Instead, they reconstruct timelines slowly through layers of sediment, volcanic ash, mineral deposits, animal remains, and chemical analysis. Each method carries uncertainty, especially in tropical cave environments where water movement, erosion, and geological disturbance can shift materials across different layers over thousands of years. Because of this, dating the island remains became one of the most debated parts of the entire discovery. Early estimates suggested that the population may have survived surprisingly recently in prehistoric terms. This possibility immediately attracted attention because it implied that another human species may have existed long after modern humans had already spread widely across the planet. Yet researchers understood that extraordinary conclusions required careful verification. Cave systems are complex environments. Sediment does not always remain perfectly undisturbed across immense stretches of time. Water flowing through caves can move bones and artifacts from one layer into another. Animals digging through the ground may disturb older deposits. Volcanic activity can reshape surrounding landscapes and alter sediment patterns gradually across generations. Archaeologists therefore study cave layers with extreme caution, documenting every detail possible before drawing broader conclusions about age and chronology. The island itself complicated these efforts further. Tropical climates accelerate decay. Organic material disappears quickly beneath heat, moisture, and acidic soil conditions. Many ancient bones survive only as fragile fragments buried within unstable sediment layers. Researchers often work with incomplete evidence where even small dating errors can significantly change interpretations about human history. A fossil estimated at one age may later appear older or younger after improved analysis techniques become available. This is why scientific understanding of prehistoric timelines often changes slowly over decades rather than emerging fully formed from a single discovery. Scientists studying the island remains used multiple approaches to estimate age. Some methods focus directly on the surrounding sediment layers. Others examined mineral buildup, volcanic material, or associated animal fossils found near the human remains. Researchers compared results carefully because no single method alone provides perfect certainty in difficult archaeological environments. Over time, debates emerged regarding how recent the population may actually have been. Some earlier interpretations suggested survival until around the end of the Ice Age, while later studies proposed older dates for at least some of the remains. The discussion remains important because even small chronological adjustments can reshape understanding of whether modern humans and the island population may have overlapped within the same broader region. The uncertainty itself reveals something deeper about prehistoric history. Modern people often imagine the human past as clearly mapped and fully understood, but much of early human history survives only in fragments scattered across unstable geological environments. Entire coastlines disappeared beneath rising seas after the Ice Age ended. Forests erased ancient campsites. Volcanic eruptions buried landscapes beneath ash and stone. Tropical rain slowly dissolved bone after bone across thousands of years. Archaeologists reconstruct humanity's origins from incomplete traces that survived almost by accident. The island population exists within exactly this kind of fragile record. Every fossil discovered there carries unusual weight because so little evidence remains overall. The dating debate also matters because it changes how human coexistence is imagined. If the population survived relatively late into prehistory, then modern humans may have shared parts of the world with another distinct branch of humanity far more recently than once believed. This does not necessarily mean direct contact occurred regularly, but it transforms the scale of human diversity in the recent prehistoric world. Instead of a single dominant human species spreading alone across empty landscapes, the Earth may still have contained isolated human populations surviving quietly in ecological corners protected by geography and separation. Scientists remain cautious because certainty is difficult in such fragmentary conditions. The archaeological record does not provide complete timelines or final answers. Yet even within uncertainty, one conclusion appears increasingly difficult to ignore. The island population survived long enough to challenge older assumptions about how recently human diversity disappeared from the Earth. Their existence forces modern humans to confront how incomplete our knowledge of our own origins still remains. Inside a cave, time does not accumulate in clean straight lines. Layers of sediment build slowly through rain, flooding, collapsing rock, volcanic ash, animal activity, and repeated human occupation spread across thousands of years. A single section of Earth may contain traces from very different periods pressed closely together beneath the ground. This complexity makes cave archaeology both valuable and extremely difficult. The island population connected to this mystery was discovered within exactly such an environment. Scientists attempting to determine the age of the remains had to separate overlapping geological events from the actual timeline of human survival. Even small disturbances within the cave could shift bones or tools from one layer into another, creating misleading impressions about age if researchers were not careful. Water posed one of the greatest challenges. Tropical caves rarely remain dry for long periods. Rainwater moves through cracks in stone, carries sediment across chambers, and gradually reshapes underground spaces over immense stretches of time. Bones may shift slightly downward through softer layers. Flooding can transport small objects from one part of a cave to another. Minerals dissolved in water also alter surrounding material chemically, complicating dating methods that rely on measuring radioactive decay or sediment accumulation. Scientists studying the island remains therefore approached each layer cautiously, comparing different forms of evidence rather than relying on a single measurement alone. Volcanic activity added another layer of uncertainty. The island exists within a region shaped constantly by eruptions and tectonic instability. Ash from ancient eruptions sometimes settled across landscapes and entered cave systems, creating important chronological markers for archaeologists. If researchers can identify the age of volcanic material within a layer, they may estimate the relative age of nearby fossils or tools. Yet volcanic events also disturb environments physically. Earthquakes shift rock, sediment collapses. Older material may become mixed with younger deposits during geological upheaval. Scientists therefore had to determine not only the age of individual layers, but whether those layers had remained stable enough to preserve an accurate sequence over time. As more detailed studies continued, some earlier dating estimates surrounding the island population began to change. Initial interpretations had suggested surprisingly recent survival deep into the late prehistoric world. Later analyses proposed that at least some remains may actually be older than first believed. These revisions did not erase the significance of the discovery itself, but they demonstrated how fragile archaeological timelines can become when evidence survives only in scattered fragments. Scientific understanding evolves gradually as methods improve and new evidence appears. Researchers often revisit earlier conclusions repeatedly, especially when discoveries carry major implications for human evolution. This process can appear uncertain from the outside, yet caution remains essential because extraordinary claims built on unstable dating risk, distorting the prehistoric record. Even with revised estimates, the island population still represents an unusually late surviving branch of humanity compared with many older evolutionary models. The debate now focuses less on a single exact date and more on understanding the broader timeline of isolation, adaptation, and disappearance. Scientists recognize that prehistoric populations did not vanish simultaneously across the planet. Human evolution unfolded unevenly. Some branches disappeared early, while others survived much longer within protected ecological regions. Islands especially may have preserved isolated populations beyond the periods once assumed possible, because deep water reduced outside contact and slowed demographic replacement. The dating uncertainties also reveal how much of early human history may already be lost permanently. Rising seas after the Ice Age submerged ancient coastlines where prehistoric humans once traveled and settled. Tropical climates erased organic material before it could fossilize. Forest growth and volcanic activity buried countless sites beneath layers of earth impossible to excavate fully. The island remains survived partly through geological luck. Without the protective environment of the cave, even these fragments may never have reached the modern world at all. Scientists therefore study each surviving layer with unusual care because so little evidence remains overall. The debate surrounding time and dating ultimately reflects something larger than chronology alone. It reveals the difficulty of reconstructing human origins from incomplete traces left behind in unstable environments. The island population exists at the edge of what archaeology can still recover. Their story survives not as a complete history, but as scattered fragments emerging slowly from darkness, forcing modern humans to accept how uncertain much of our own past still remains. The debate over the island population's age eventually became larger than a question of numbers alone. Behind every revised estimate stood a deeper uncertainty about how recently human diversity survived on Earth. If the population disappeared earlier than first believed, the timeline of coexistence with modern humans becomes narrower. If they survived later, then another branch of humanity may have remained alive, surprisingly close to the beginning of recorded civilization elsewhere in the world. Scientists approach this question carefully because public attention often focused too heavily on dramatic dates rather than the broader scientific reality. Archaeology rarely provides exact endings. Human populations do not vanish according to a single calendar year. Decline unfolds gradually across generations, often leaving incomplete traces behind. The island record reflects exactly this kind of fading history. Researchers studying the cave remains increasingly recognize that the archaeological evidence represented multiple periods rather than one isolated moment. Stone tools, animal remains, sediment layers, and fossils accumulated slowly over immense stretches of time. Some layers suggested very old occupation deep in prehistory, others hinted at later survival. The challenge was determining whether these traces belonged continuously to the same isolated population or reflected separate episodes of human presence across different eras. Tropical cave systems complicate such interpretations because environmental disturbance may shift materials between layers over thousands of years. Scientists therefore remained cautious about drawing simple conclusions from fragmented evidence. At the same time, the overall pattern still suggested remarkable persistence. The island population survived long enough to force a reconsideration of older assumptions about human evolution. Earlier models often imagined non-modern human groups disappearing relatively early before modern humans spread fully across Eurasia and island Southeast Asia. The cave discoveries revealed a more uneven reality. Different human populations may have survived in ecological isolation much longer than previously expected. Islands especially appear capable of preserving unusual evolutionary branches because deep water slows migration and reduces outside demographic pressure. Geography protected separation across generations even while surrounding regions changed dramatically. The uncertainty surrounding the dates also exposed a tension within modern ideas about science itself. Many people expect archaeology to deliver final answers with complete certainty, yet prehistoric research often works at the edge of what evidence can still preserve. Scientists reconstruct enormous spans of human history from fragile fragments buried beneath unstable environments. Every fossil survives through rare circumstances. Every layer of sediment reflects countless geological events impossible to observe directly now. New dating methods improve understanding gradually, but they also reveal how much earlier interpretations depended on incomplete information. This constant revision is not failure. It is part of how scientific knowledge advances cautiously over time. The island population became one of the clearest examples of this process in modern paleoanthropology. Some earlier claims about very recent survival have since been debated or adjusted, yet the larger significance remains powerful regardless of exact chronology. The population still represents an isolated branch of humanity surviving long after many scientists once assumed such diversity had disappeared entirely. Their existence alone changes the emotional shape of the human story. Modern humans now stand alone, but for most of prehistory the world may have contained multiple forms of humanity, living separately across different environments. Some adapted to cold northern climates, others survived within forests, mountains, or isolated islands shaped by rising seas and volcanic instability. The island population belonged to that wider, lost diversity. The silence surrounding their final disappearance remains especially striking. Archaeology reveals no clear ending. No evidence of sudden destruction appears inside the cave layers. No preserved memory survives describing their last generations. Instead, the record simply becomes quieter over time. Fewer remains. Fewer traces, eventually nothing at all. This gradual fading may explain why so much of human evolution remained misunderstood for so long. Extinction does not always announce itself dramatically. Entire branches of humanity may disappear slowly until only fragments remain buried beneath stone and sediment, waiting for discovery thousands of years later. The island population forces modern humans to confront an unsettling possibility. Much of our own evolutionary past may already be gone beyond recovery, erased by climate, water, time, and the fragile nature of memory itself. What survives in the caves today may represent only a small surviving shadow of a far larger human world that once existed beside us. One of the strangest aspects of the island population is not only how long they may have survived, but how little evidence they left behind. Modern humans often imagine that important histories naturally preserve themselves through monuments, artifacts, written language, or large archaeological sites. Prehistoric reality is far less stable. Most human lives disappear almost completely after enough time passes. Wood decays, cloth dissolves, bones fracture and vanish beneath moisture, heat, roots, and shifting soil. Entire populations may survive for thousands of years while leaving only scattered fragments behind. On tropical islands, this process becomes even more severe. The climate actively destroys memory. Heavy rainfall, warm temperatures, insects, acidic ground, and dense plant growth gradually erase physical traces generation after generation. The island population connected to this mystery survived within exactly such an environment. This helps explain why their story remained hidden for so long. Scientists studying human origins depend heavily on preservation. Dry caves, frozen ground, or stable sediment layers occasionally protect ancient remains long enough for modern discovery. Tropical forests rarely offer such protection. Organic material breaks down rapidly once exposed to moisture and heat. Even when bones survive, they often appear fragmented and fragile rather than complete. Researchers working on the island therefore reconstructed the population's history from extremely limited evidence. A skull fragment, teeth, limb bones, stone tools buried in cave layers beneath volcanic sediment. These remains became enormously important precisely because so little else endured. The silence surrounding the population does not necessarily mean they were insignificant within prehistory. It may simply reflect how easily human existence disappears from the archaeological record under difficult environmental conditions. Rising sea levels after the Ice Age deepened this loss. During colder prehistoric periods, lower seas exposed broader coastal plains around many islands in Southeast Asia. Human groups likely traveled, hunted, and settled across regions that later vanished beneath advancing water as the climate warmed. Entire coastlines now lie underwater beyond ordinary archaeological reach. Scientists suspect that many traces of prehistoric island populations disappeared permanently during this transformation. Campsites, migration routes, gathering areas, and coastal settlements may now rest beneath the sea where evidence becomes difficult or impossible to recover fully. The surviving cave remains therefore represent only a small surviving window into a much larger lost landscape. Volcanic activity also shaped what survived. The island exists within a geologically unstable region marked by eruptions, earthquakes, and shifting terrain across immense stretches of time. Volcanic ash can preserve certain archaeological layers by sealing them beneath sediment. At the same time, eruptions destroy environments, bury settlements, and alter ecosystems completely. Forest growth then slowly reclaims the land over centuries. Human traces vanish beneath roots, soil movement, and tropical decay until almost nothing visible remains. Archaeologists arriving thousands of years later encounter only fragments surviving through rare combinations of geological luck and careful excavation. The island population exists today largely because some of those fragments endured long enough to be discovered. Scientists increasingly recognize that this pattern may apply far beyond a single island. Much of early human history may already be gone forever. Populations that left no durable stone architecture or written records could disappear almost completely from scientific knowledge. Fossil preservation itself is rare and uneven across the planet. Some environments preserve ancient remains exceptionally well, creating the illusion that those regions were more important historically. Other areas erase evidence so effectively that entire chapters of human evolution remain nearly invisible. Tropical Southeast Asia may contain many such missing chapters. The island population reminds researchers how incomplete the prehistoric record truly is. The discovery also changes how human uniqueness is understood. Modern humans survived while other human branches disappeared, yet survival does not necessarily mean we preserve memory better across deep time. Without stable environments protecting bones and artifacts, even our own distant ancestors would vanish almost entirely from the record. The island population survived for thousands of years, adapted to difficult ecological conditions, and endured changing climates surrounded by dangerous seas. Yet today, almost nothing remains of their existence beyond scattered bones and simple tools buried in caves. Their story survives only in fragments rescued from an environment that spent millennia trying to erase them completely. The deeper scientists look into prehistoric human history, the more they encounter absence instead of certainty. Entire stretches of time survive only through scattered fragments separated by enormous gaps. A single tooth may represent thousands of years of existence. A few stone tools buried inside cave sediment may become the only surviving evidence that humans once occupied a region at all. The island population connected to this mystery exists within exactly this kind of fragile archaeological silence. Modern researchers know they survived because a handful of remains endured long enough to be discovered. Yet the overwhelming majority of their lives disappeared completely. Their voices, movements, relationships, and daily routines left almost no permanent trace behind. Tropical environments accelerate this disappearance relentlessly. In colder or drier climates, ancient human remains sometimes survive with remarkable preservation. Frozen ground protects soft tissue. Dry caves slow decay. Stable sediment layers preserve campsites for tens of thousands of years. Tropical forests work differently. Heat and moisture encourage rapid biological breakdown. Plant roots push through buried layers. Insects and microorganisms consume organic material continuously. Heavy rainfall shifts soil and sediment over long periods. Bones that survive initially often become fragile fragments, difficult to recover intact. Archaeologists working in such conditions rarely uncover complete histories. They reconstruct partial outlines from whatever chance allowed to remain hidden beneath the ground. The island itself likely contained far more evidence than survives today. Ancient campsites near prehistoric coastlines may now rest beneath the ocean because sea levels rose dramatically after the Ice Age ended. Rivers changed direction repeatedly across thousands of years. Volcanic eruptions buried landscapes beneath ash and rock. Forests expanded over abandoned areas until traces of human occupation disappeared almost entirely. Scientists suspect that many prehistoric populations across island Southeast Asia vanished from the archaeological record long before modern research even began. The island population may therefore represent only one surviving fragment of a much broader human diversity that once existed across the region. This possibility unsettles many older ideas about human evolution. Modern people often imagine prehistory as a clear sequence leading steadily toward the present world. The fossil record tells a more fragmented story. Some human populations appear briefly before disappearing again into silence. Others may have survived for immense periods without leaving enough evidence to reconstruct their full history. Preservation depends heavily on environmental luck rather than historical importance. A population living in favorable geological conditions may leave abundant fossils, while another surviving equally long in tropical forests leaves almost nothing behind. Scientists therefore remain careful about assuming absence of evidence means absence of human existence itself. The island population illustrates this problem clearly. Their remains survived only because a few caves protected fragments from complete destruction. Even there, much of the evidence remained damaged, incomplete, or difficult to date precisely. Researchers reconstructed the population's anatomy and timeline slowly through years of careful comparison and analysis. Yet enormous gaps still remain. Scientists cannot fully describe social organization, language, symbolic behavior, or many aspects of daily survival because the material record is too limited. Modern humans naturally seek complete stories, but prehistoric archaeology often provides only scattered pieces that resist final certainty. The silence surrounding the island population also changes the emotional meaning of extinction. Modern societies tend to imagine disappearance as dramatic and visible. In reality, entire human branches may fade gradually without monuments, written records, or surviving memory. Small, isolated populations leave fewer traces simply because fewer people lived there over time. Once ecological pressure, demographic decline, or environmental instability reduce those populations further, the remaining evidence may disappear almost entirely within only a few thousand years. The island population appears to have undergone exactly this kind of fading. Their existence stretched across immense periods, yet the surviving archaeological record became thinner and quieter until eventually almost nothing remained. This realization carries a difficult implication for understanding human origins. Much of humanity's evolutionary history may already be permanently lost. Countless generations lived, adapted, struggled, and disappeared in environments that erased them almost completely. The island caves preserved enough fragments to reveal one forgotten branch of humanity, but they also reveal how many other stories may never be recovered at all. What modern humans call history may represent only the smallest surviving surface of a far larger and mostly vanished human past. The island population survived for thousands of years, yet modern humans know almost nothing about them with certainty. This imbalance between long existence and limited evidence reveals one of the hardest truths in archaeology. Time destroys memory unevenly. Some civilizations leave behind enormous cities, inscriptions, and monuments that survive for millennia. Other human groups vanish so completely that only a few broken bones remain to suggest they ever existed at all. The island humans belong to the second kind of history. Their world left almost no durable record. The forests closed over their paths. Rain dissolved organic material generation after generation. Rising seas erased ancient coastlines where people may once have traveled or gathered food. By the time modern researchers arrived, nearly all direct traces of their existence had already disappeared. Scientists increasingly suspect that this pattern was not unique. The prehistoric human world may once have been filled with small, isolated populations whose histories vanished before archaeology could recover them. Tropical islands especially create conditions where survival leaves little permanent evidence behind. A human group may occupy caves, forests, and coastlines for immense stretches of time while preserving almost nothing recognizable after enough centuries pass. Stone tools endure longer than flesh or wood, but even tools reveal only fragments of behavior. They cannot fully explain language, memory, social bonds, or emotional life. The island population, therefore, survives in science mainly as anatomy and geological traces, rather than as complete human history. This limitation forces researchers to remain cautious. The temptation to fill gaps with imagination remains strong whenever evidence is scarce. Yet responsible archaeology depends on resisting certainty, where certainty cannot exist. The surviving fossils reveal physical adaptation to isolation, but they cannot describe exactly how the population understood the world around them. Scientists avoid assigning detailed beliefs, myths, or social structures without direct evidence. The silence surrounding the island humans remains part of the story itself. Their disappearance was so complete that modern humans recovered only shadows buried beneath caves and volcanic sediment. Even the archaeological discoveries that survive today exist partly because of accident. A cave protected bone fragments from tropical decay. Sediment layers remained stable long enough for excavation. Geological conditions preserved enough material for analysis before erosion destroyed everything entirely. Without those rare conditions, the island population might never have entered scientific knowledge at all. Their extinction would have passed unnoticed even in modern times. This possibility changes how researchers think about the human past. The fossil record no longer appears as a complete map of evolution. Instead, it resembles scattered islands of evidence separated by enormous darkness where countless lives once unfolded invisibly. Modern humans now stand alone as the final surviving human species, which creates the illusion that our history was inevitable and fully known. The island population challenges that illusion directly. Their existence demonstrates that branches of humanity survived far longer and in more varied forms than many earlier theories once imagined. At the same time, their near disappearance from the archaeological record reveals how fragile historical memory truly is across deep time. The Earth does not preserve human stories equally. Climate, geology, erosion, and environmental instability decide what survives long after populations themselves vanish. Entire chapters of human evolution may already be gone beyond recovery. The island caves preserved only enough evidence to suggest the outline of a forgotten human branch adapting quietly to isolation for immense stretches of time. Beyond those fragments lies uncertainty that may never be resolved fully. Yet even this incomplete picture carries enormous meaning. The island humans remind modern people that humanity was once more diverse, more fragmented, and more vulnerable than it appears today. Different human populations adapted to different ecological worlds, survived for long periods, and disappeared without leaving stable memory behind. The bones buried beneath tropical stone now reveal not only the existence of one lost human group, but also the limits of what modern science can still recover about humanity's own origins. Somewhere beyond the surviving fossils and tools, entire worlds of prehistoric human experience may already have vanished forever without witness, record, or name. Isolation protected the island population for an extraordinarily long time. Deep water separated them from many of the large demographic movements reshaping prehistoric humanity elsewhere. While modern humans expanded across continents and coastlines, the island remained partially shielded by geography itself. Dangerous ocean channels slowed migration and reduced sustained outside contact. This separation allowed unusual biological traits to persist across generations instead of being absorbed into larger human populations. The island became a kind of refuge where a distinct branch of humanity could continue surviving quietly while much of the surrounding world changed. Yet the same isolation that preserved them also created the conditions that may eventually have led to their disappearance. Small, isolated populations live within narrow margins of survival. Every environmental change carries greater risk because there are fewer people, fewer resources, and fewer opportunities for recovery after disruption. Scientists studying island ecosystems repeatedly observe this pattern in both animals and human communities. Isolation reduces competition from the outside, but it also reduces resilience from within. Large continental populations can survive local disasters through migration, exchange, and demographic scale. Island groups rarely possess the same flexibility. If food supplies decline, coastlines shift, or disease spreads through a small isolated population, recovery becomes much more difficult. The island population connected to this mystery appears to have existed under exactly these conditions for immense stretches of time. Their environment was never entirely stable. Volcanic activity shaped the region repeatedly across generations. Earthquakes altered landscapes. Heavy rainfall shifted river systems and cave sediments. Rising sea levels after the Ice Age slowly transformed coastlines that earlier populations may once have depended upon for movement and food gathering. Forest patterns changed as climate conditions shifted gradually over thousands of years. Each change alone may not have destroyed the population. Together, however, long-term environmental instability could place continuous pressure on small communities already living close to ecological limits. Scientists believe this kind of slow pressure often shapes prehistoric extinction more strongly than sudden catastrophe. Demography likely played an important role as well. Small populations face biological risks that become increasingly serious across long periods of isolation. Genetic diversity tends to shrink when communities remain separated from outside groups for many generations. Harmful genetic traits may spread more easily through a confined population. Fertility rates can fluctuate unpredictably. Disease outbreaks or food shortages may reduce numbers below sustainable levels without leaving obvious archaeological evidence behind. Researchers studying human evolution emphasize that extinction does not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes populations decline gradually until recovery becomes impossible. The island humans may have experienced exactly this kind of slow demographic weakening over time. Modern human expansion across surrounding regions may have intensified these pressures even without direct conflict. Larger interconnected populations often adapt more flexibly to changing climates and shifting resources because they maintain broader social and migration networks. Small, isolated groups do not possess those advantages. Even occasional competition for coastal resources or movement routes could create stress within already fragile ecological systems. Scientists remain cautious because no direct evidence proves warfare or violent replacement between modern humans and the island population. The archaeological record simply does not support such certainty. Yet coexistence alone may have altered survival conditions gradually across generations. The silence surrounding the population's final disappearance reflects this complexity. No battlefield survives. No clear destruction layer appears in the caves. Instead, the archaeological traces become thinner over time. Stone tools appear less frequently. Human remains vanish from later sediments. Eventually, the record falls quiet entirely. This pattern suggests fading rather than sudden collapse. Isolation preserved the population for thousands of years because it protected them from many outside pressures affecting larger human populations. At the same time, isolation trapped them within an ecological and demographic system too fragile to endure permanent change forever. the island became both shelter and prison at once. It allowed a distinct branch of humanity to survive long after many others disappeared, yet it also limited their ability to respond when climate, geography, and the wider human world slowly transformed around them. Their long survival now stands as evidence of extraordinary adaptation. Their disappearance reveals how fragile even successful adaptation can become when an entire population exists within the narrow boundaries of a small world surrounded by sea. Small populations survive differently from large civilizations. Their existence depends less on expansion and more on maintaining balance across generations. On the isolated island, that balance may always have remained fragile beneath the surface. The population occupied a confined ecological world where resources could not increase endlessly. Forests regenerated slowly after disturbance. Coastal food sources shifted with changing tides and storms. Fresh water depended heavily on rainfall and stable environmental conditions. Every generation inherited the same narrow landscape surrounded by dangerous seas that limited escape and outside support. For long periods, the population adapted successfully to these conditions. Yet adaptation itself does not remove vulnerability. It only delays collapse while the surrounding environment remains within survivable limits. Scientists studying prehistoric island populations often emphasize how easily demographic instability can spread once numbers begin shrinking. Large populations contain buffers against loss. If disease, famine, or environmental disruption affects one region, migration and exchange may help restore stability. Small, isolated groups rarely possess that protection. A temporary decline in birth rates, food availability, or survival during childhood may continue across generations until the population becomes too small to recover fully. Archaeological evidence rarely preserves these slow demographic changes directly. Bones and tools reveal presence or absence more easily than gradual weakening across centuries. The island population may therefore have experienced long-term decline invisible in the surviving fossil record. Genetic isolation likely intensified these risks over immense stretches of time. Populations separated from outside groups for many generations gradually lose genetic diversity. Harmful inherited traits may spread more easily within confined communities. Resistance to disease can weaken. Reproductive stability may become more fragile. Scientists cannot fully reconstruct the biological condition of the island population because the surviving remains remain limited. Even so, researchers recognize that long isolation creates evolutionary pressures that operate slowly but persistently across centuries. The same separation that preserved the population from outside competition also reduced its ability to recover from internal weakness once ecological conditions changed. Climate shifts after the Ice Age may have accelerated this process. Rising seas flooded low coastal plains throughout Southeast Asia, transforming migration routes and resource zones that prehistoric populations once depended upon. Forest distributions changed gradually with temperature and rainfall patterns. Some caves became inaccessible or less useful as surrounding environments shifted. Small ecological changes can affect isolated island populations disproportionately because survival systems remain tightly connected to local geography. A reduction in available coastline or freshwater access may carry consequences across entire generations when no alternative territories exist nearby. Volcanic activity may have added further instability. The region surrounding the island remained geologically active throughout prehistory. Eruptions alter vegetation, contaminate water sources, and reshape hunting environments. Earthquakes shift terrain and disturb caves used for shelter. Larger continental populations may survive such disruptions by relocating into neighboring regions. Islands restrict that possibility severely. The population trapped there had to adapt repeatedly within the same confined ecological space, no matter how unstable conditions became over time. Scientists increasingly believe that extinction often emerges through overlapping pressures rather than single dramatic causes. Climate instability, shrinking genetic diversity, ecological stress, demographic decline, and outside competition may all interact gradually until recovery becomes impossible. The island population likely existed within exactly this kind of fragile system for much of its later history. Modern humans moving through surrounding regions may have increased pressure indirectly even without violent conflict. Larger populations adapting flexibly across expanding migration networks could outcompete isolated groups for limited resources over long periods simply through demographic scale and mobility. Yet the archaeological record remains remarkably quiet about the final stages of disappearance itself. No clear evidence of warfare appears. No mass graves or destruction layers survive within the caves. Instead, the traces fade slowly. Human remains become rarer. Tool evidence thins. Eventually, silence replaces evidence entirely. This gradual disappearance may explain why extinction remains difficult to recognize in deep prehistory. Populations do not always vanish through visible catastrophe. Sometimes they simply become too small, too isolated, and too vulnerable to continue surviving within a changing world. The island population endured for thousands of years through remarkable adaptation to confinement and ecological limitation. Yet in the end, the same isolation that protected them may also have prevented them from escaping the slow pressures that eventually erased them from the earth. The disappearance of the island population may have happened so slowly that no single generation fully understood what was taking place. Modern people often imagine extinction as sudden and visible, marked by catastrophe, violence, or dramatic collapse. Prehistoric reality was frequently quieter. Small populations can decline across centuries, while daily life continues appearing familiar to those still alive within the community. Birth rates slowly fall. Environmental conditions become less stable. Food grows slightly harder to obtain each generation. Illness spreads more easily through isolated groups. The population shrinks gradually until eventually too few people remain to sustain long-term survival. Archaeology rarely captures this process clearly because the physical traces left behind become thinner and more fragmented over time. The island record reflects exactly this kind of fading silence. Scientists studying extinction across island ecosystems repeatedly observe how isolation creates both resilience and fragility at the same time. A population protected from outside pressures may survive for immense stretches of time, yet once environmental balance weakens, recovery becomes extremely difficult. The island humans adapted successfully to confinement for thousands of years. Their bodies, tools, and survival patterns reflected deep familiarity with the local environment. Yet adaptation tied them closely to a world that could not expand with them. Forests, coastlines, freshwater sources, and caves all existed within narrow ecological limits. When climate shifts, sea level rise, or demographic decline altered those systems, the population may have had nowhere else to go. Rising seas after the Ice Age likely intensified this pressure continuously. Coastal plains disappeared beneath advancing water across Southeast Asia, reducing habitable land and changing access to resources. Earlier movement routes vanished. Shorelines shifted inland generation after generation. Human groups that once occupied wider coastal landscapes may have become increasingly compressed into smaller territories as the ocean reclaimed low ground. On continents, populations sometimes responded to environmental change through migration into neighboring regions. Islands reduce that possibility severely. Water becomes a barrier, trapping communities inside shrinking ecological space. Scientists suspect this geographic confinement played a major role in the vulnerability of many prehistoric island populations, including the humans connected to this mystery. Modern human expansion across surrounding regions may also have contributed indirectly to the island population's final decline. Researchers remain cautious because no evidence clearly supports violent replacement or organized conflict. Yet competition does not always require warfare. Larger, more connected populations often adapt more flexibly to changing environments, simply because they possess broader networks of movement and exchange. Small, isolated communities rarely compete effectively over long periods once outside demographic pressure begins increasing nearby. Even occasional contact may introduce disease, resource competition, or ecological stress difficult for isolated populations to survive. The island humans may have faced these pressures gradually while already weakened by shrinking numbers and environmental instability. What makes their disappearance especially haunting is the absence of a clear ending. The archaeological record preserves no final moment. No evidence reveals the last surviving family or the final occupied cave. Instead, the traces become fewer and quieter until eventually they stop altogether. Stone tools vanish from later layers. Human bones no longer appear in the sediment. The silence deepens, and then only modern humans remain. This pattern suggests extinction unfolding not as sudden destruction, but as gradual erasure across generations invisible to the wider world. Entire branches of humanity may have disappeared this way without witness or memory surviving beyond scattered fossils buried underground. The island population forces modern humans to confront how fragile human existence has always been. Today, humanity dominates the planet so completely that extinction can seem unimaginable at the species level. Yet for most of prehistory, human survival was uncertain and uneven. Different branches of humanity adapted to isolated environments, endured changing climates, and disappeared when conditions shifted beyond recovery. The island humans survived remarkably long within a confined world surrounded by sea, forests, and volcanic instability. Their endurance was real. So was their vulnerability. In the end, the same isolation that preserved them from many outside pressures may also have ensured that once decline began, there would be no larger network left to save them. Their story faded quietly into the earth until only fragments remained to remind modern humans how narrow survival can become when an entire world exists inside the boundaries of a single island. No one witnessed the final disappearance of the island population. No written account survives describing their last years, their last shelters, or the final generation born into their isolated world. By the time modern humans developed civilizations capable of recording history, the island humans were already gone. What remains today are fragments buried beneath cave sediment and volcanic earth, a few bones, stone tools, layers of ash and soil preserving traces of existence without preserving memory itself. This absence creates one of the most unsettling aspects of the story. An entire branch of humanity may have vanished from the earth without leaving behind a single direct account of how or why it happened. Archaeology reveals presence more easily than endings. Scientists can identify periods when human activity appears within cave layers through tools, charcoal, animal remains, and fossils. Determining exactly when that activity stopped is far more difficult. The archaeological record often fades gradually rather than ending cleanly. On the island, this fading silence becomes especially visible. Earlier layers preserve clearer evidence of occupation. Later traces grow thinner and more uncertain, until eventually the record falls quiet altogether. Researchers cannot point to a final dramatic event, preserved in stone. Instead, the disappearance appears to have unfolded slowly within an environment already shaped by instability and isolation. The island itself may have contributed to this quiet ending. Small, isolated populations often leave very limited archaeological evidence even during periods of stability. Once numbers begin declining, the surviving traces become even harder to detect. A shrinking population occupies fewer caves, leaves behind fewer tools, and produces fewer remains likely to survive thousands of years underground. Environmental destruction then removes much of what remains. Tropical rainfall erodes sediment. Plant roots disturb buried layers. Rising seas erase coastal settlements. Volcanic activity reshapes landscapes repeatedly across generations. Entire communities may disappear while leaving almost no final signature visible to future researchers. Scientists studying prehistoric extinction increasingly recognize that disappearance rarely follows a simple pattern. Some populations collapse suddenly through catastrophe. Others decline gradually across centuries due to overlapping pressures such as climate instability, shrinking resources, disease, demographic weakness, and isolation. The island humans likely faced several of these pressures simultaneously. Rising sea levels transformed coastlines after the Ice Age. Ecological space became more restricted. Small population size reduced resilience against environmental disruption. Modern humans expanding through surrounding regions may also have increased pressure indirectly through competition for resources and territory. None of these factors alone necessarily caused extinction. Together, however, they may have slowly weakened the population generation after generation. What makes this process difficult to understand emotionally is its lack of visible drama. Modern culture often treats extinction as something sudden and catastrophic. The island population suggests another possibility. A human group may simply become smaller and quieter until eventually no one remains. The final survivors may never have realized they belonged to the last generation of their kind. Daily life may have continued normally even as the broader population declined beyond recovery. Archaeology cannot answer these questions directly because the evidence preserves bodies and tools, not awareness itself. Yet the silence left behind encourages such reflections naturally. Somewhere within the forests, caves, and coastlines of the island, the final traces of a distinct human branch disappeared without witness. The world continued changing around them while no larger human society recorded their passing. This quiet extinction also changes how modern humans think about permanence. Today, humanity appears dominant across the planet, connected through enormous technological systems and global communication. The island humans reveal how temporary, even long survival can become across deep time. They endured for thousands of years within difficult environmental conditions, adapting successfully to isolation longer than many scientists once believed possible. Yet endurance alone could not guarantee permanence. Geography protected them while also trapping them. Their world remained small while surrounding human history expanded beyond the island seas. Eventually, the traces became too faint to continue. Only much later did archaeologists uncover fragments revealing that another form of humanity had once survived there, almost entirely forgotten by time itself. The island now stands not only as evidence of biological diversity within human evolution, but also as a reminder that extinction does not always arrive loudly enough for history to notice when it happens. The silence left behind by the island population may be one of the most important parts of their story. Modern humans are surrounded by records. Cities preserve names. Photographs capture faces. Written language stores memory across generations. Prehistoric humanity existed within a very different relationship to time. Most human lives passed without permanent documentation, and small isolated populations often vanished without leaving enough traces for future people to remember them at all. The island humans appear to have disappeared in exactly this way. Their extinction did not become an event in history, because no civilization remained nearby to observe or record it. By the time modern societies emerged across later centuries, the population had already faded into silence beneath caves, forests, and volcanic earth. Archaeologists attempting to reconstruct their final existence face a difficult problem. Evidence becomes thinner, precisely during the periods when extinction likely approaches. A healthy population leaves repeated traces through occupation sites, tools, fires, food remains, and burials. Declining populations leave fewer signs behind. Small communities moving less frequently or occupying fewer shelters become harder to detect within the archaeological record. Environmental destruction then removes additional evidence over thousands of years. Tropical climates accelerate this loss constantly. Heat, moisture, flooding, roots, and erosion gradually erase fragile traces until entire centuries disappear from recoverable history. The island population therefore became nearly invisible long before modern humans recognized they had existed at all. Scientists sometimes describe prehistoric extinction as a process of demographic fading rather than dramatic collapse. A population may shrink slowly across generations, while still maintaining ordinary patterns of daily survival. People continue gathering food, caring for children, using familiar caves, and moving through known landscapes even as numbers decline quietly around them. The final generations may never perceive their disappearance as part of a larger historical process. They simply experience increasingly fragile survival within a changing world. The island population may have lived through exactly this kind of slow narrowing. Rising seas reduced available coastal territory. Ecological pressure intensified within confined island environments. Small population size weakened resilience against illness, food shortages, and environmental instability. Modern humans expanding across surrounding regions may have introduced additional competition without direct violent confrontation ever occurring. Over enough generations, survival margins may simply have become too narrow to sustain recovery. Yet archaeology preserves no final moment where this process becomes visible clearly. The caves contain no dramatic ending. No evidence suggests organized warfare, mass death, or sudden destruction. Instead, occupation traces become more uncertain over time. The record grows quieter until eventually only absence remains. This absence itself carries enormous meaning because it reveals how extinction often unfolds invisibly across deep time. Entire branches of humanity may disappear gradually while the wider world continues unchanged around them. The island humans were not defeated publicly or remembered ceremonially. They simply ceased to exist while forests regrew, coastlines shifted, and volcanic landscapes continued reshaping themselves over centuries. Modern humans now stand alone as the final surviving human species, which creates the illusion that this outcome was natural or inevitable. The island population challenges that assumption. For most of prehistory, humanity existed as multiple populations adapted to different ecological worlds. Some survived in cold northern climates, others occupied deserts, forests, or isolated islands. Their coexistence may have lasted far longer than earlier scientific models once proposed. The disappearance of those other human branches did not happen all at once. It unfolded unevenly across geography and time, often without leaving enough evidence for modern reconstruction. The island humans now survive only through scattered fossils and tools rescued from an environment that almost erased them completely. Their story forces modern people to confront a difficult truth about historical memory itself. What humanity remembers depends heavily on what the Earth allows to survive. Countless generations lived full human lives before written language existed, and many of those lives have already vanished beyond recovery. The island population endured for immense stretches of time inside a small world surrounded by sea and isolation. Their extinction passed unnoticed by history, because history, in the modern sense, had not yet begun to notice most humans at all. Only thousands of years later did fragments buried beneath stone reveal that another branch of humanity had once existed there quietly before disappearing almost without a trace. The final disappearance of the island population may never be understood completely. Archaeology can reveal bones, tools, and layers of sediment, but it cannot fully recover the final emotions, decisions, or experiences of the people who once lived there. Scientists therefore approach the end of the population with caution. The evidence supports long isolation, gradual decline, and eventual disappearance, yet the exact path toward extinction remains uncertain. This uncertainty itself has become one of the most important lessons of the discovery. Human history across deep time is far less complete than modern societies often assume. Entire populations may vanish while leaving behind only fragments too small to preserve a full story. The island humans existed within a world already shaped by limits. Their environment remained confined by sea, forests, volcanic terrain, and changing coastlines. Isolation protected them from some outside pressures, while also reducing their ability to adapt once conditions shifted beyond sustainable boundaries. Rising oceans after the Ice Age transformed the geography surrounding the island slowly but continuously. Ecological space likely narrowed across generations. Small populations living within restricted environments often struggle to recover from repeated environmental stress. Climate instability, shrinking resources, disease exposure, and demographic decline may all have interacted gradually until survival became impossible. Yet none of these pressures necessarily produced a sudden visible collapse. The archaeological record instead suggests fading silence rather than catastrophe. This quiet ending separates the island story from many popular ideas about extinction. Modern culture often expects dramatic conclusions filled with conflict or disaster. The island humans may have disappeared without either. Their extinction may have resembled erosion more than destruction. A population becomes smaller, movement patterns contract, fewer children survive, occupied caves are abandoned one by one. Eventually the final traces vanish beneath forest growth, sediment, and time. No larger civilization records the process because no one outside the island fully understands what is disappearing. The world simply continues changing while one branch of humanity slowly fades from existence. Scientists studying prehistoric extinctions increasingly recognize how common this pattern may have been. Human evolution did not unfold as a clean sequence where one population disappeared immediately before another emerged. Different groups likely survived unevenly across various ecological regions for long periods. Some populations vanished early, others persisted quietly in isolated environments protected temporarily by geography. Islands became especially important refuges because water slowed migration and reduced direct outside pressure. At the same time, those same islands trapped populations within fragile ecological systems vulnerable to long-term instability. The island humans appear to have survived within exactly such a balance for thousands of years before eventually reaching its limits. Their disappearance also changes how modern humans understand survival itself. Today, humanity dominates the planet technologically, yet the island population reminds us that biological success is never permanent across evolutionary time. The modern human species survived while others disappeared, but this outcome was not guaranteed in advance. Geography, climate, population size, adaptation, and chance all shaped which human branches endured and which vanished. The island humans adapted successfully to their environment for immense stretches of time. Their survival was real, not primitive failure. Yet adaptation to one specific ecological world can become dangerous once that world changes too quickly or too completely. The same traits that preserve a population under stable conditions may limit flexibility when instability arrives. In the end, almost nothing remained of the island humans beyond scattered fossils and simple tools hidden underground. Their extinction passed unnoticed by any written history because no written history existed there to remember them. Only much later did archaeologists uncover fragments suggesting that another form of humanity had once lived quietly on the island, long after many scientists once assumed such diversity had disappeared. The silence surrounding their end remains unresolved. No final witness survives. No preserved memory explains how the last generations lived or died. Yet perhaps that silence carries its own meaning. Human history is not only the story of what survived, it is also the story of what vanished so completely that modern people can now see only faint outlines where entire human worlds once existed beneath the surface of the earth. The discovery of the island population changed more than scientific timelines. It changed the emotional shape of human history itself. For much of modern history, people imagined humanity as a single, successful line, moving steadily upward from primitive beginnings towards civilization and technological progress. The island humans revealed a far more complicated reality. For most of prehistory, humanity was not one unified species spreading alone across the earth. Different branches of humans existed simultaneously in separate environments, adapting to different ecological pressures while following very different evolutionary paths. Some survived in cold northern regions. Others adapted to forests, coastlines, deserts, or isolated islands surrounded by dangerous seas. Modern humans are now the only surviving branch, but that survival hides how diverse the human world once was. The island population forces modern people to confront this lost diversity directly. Their bodies look different. Their environment shaped them differently. Their history unfolded separately from the larger continental populations that eventually produced cities, agriculture, and written memory. Yet they were still human in the deepest evolutionary sense. They made tools, used fire, adapted to difficult conditions, and survived for immense stretches of time within a changing world. Their existence reveals that humanity was never defined by a single body shape, single environment, or single path of survival. Human evolution was branching, uneven, and deeply influenced by geography. Islands preserved some of those branches longer than anyone once expected. Scientists increasingly recognize that survival in evolution does not necessarily belong to the strongest, largest, or most technologically advanced populations. Survival often depends on conditions impossible to predict fully. Geography may protect one population while exposing another. Climate shifts may destroy stable ecosystems unexpectedly. Small, isolated groups may endure quietly for thousands of years because they fit closely within local environments, while larger populations elsewhere disappear under different pressures. The island humans survived far longer than earlier scientific models once imagined possible precisely because isolation protected them for so long. Yet that same isolation eventually became part of their vulnerability as the surrounding world changed. This realization carries uncomfortable implications for how modern humans think about progress. The island population was not simply an earlier, imperfect version of humanity waiting to become modern. They represented a separate adaptation to a specific ecological world. Their bodies and survival strategies reflected long-term adjustment to confined island environments rather than failure to advance towards civilization. Modern ideas about human superiority often assume evolution follows a single direction toward increasing complexity, size, and technological control. The island humans suggest something far less simple. Different human populations adapted successfully to different conditions, and survival depended heavily on environmental balance rather than inevitable progress alone. The discovery also reveals how fragile human memory becomes across deep time. The island humans survived for thousands of years, yet almost all evidence of their existence disappeared before modern science uncovered a few surviving fragments. Without the protection of caves and unusual geological preservation, they may never have entered human knowledge again at all. Entire branches of humanity could vanish this way, erased by climate, erosion, rising seas, and the slow destruction of organic material over immense stretches of time. What modern people call human history may represent only a small surviving portion of a much larger and mostly forgotten human past. The island therefore stands as both scientific evidence and philosophical warning. It reminds modern humans that our species is not the center of an inevitable story stretching cleanly from the past into the future. We are one surviving branch within a far older evolutionary family shaped by chance, geography, climate, and adaptation. The island humans existed beside us in evolutionary time far more recently than many people once believed possible. Their disappearance was quiet enough that history never recorded it, yet their rediscovery now forces modern humanity to look backward differently. Beneath the surface of the Earth, beyond written memory and beyond surviving civilizations, countless human lives once unfolded in worlds almost completely lost to time. The island population reveals only one small surviving shadow of that vanished human diversity. Modern humans often imagine themselves as the final and complete form of humanity. The island population challenges that assumption quietly but deeply. Their existence suggests that being human was once far more flexible than modern people usually understand. Different human groups adapted to different ecological worlds for immense stretches of time, shaping bodies and survival strategies according to local conditions, rather than following a single universal path. The island humans evolved within confinement, limited resources, rising seas, volcanic instability, and long separation from larger populations. Their survival proves that humanity could exist in forms shaped by environments very different from those that later produced agriculture, cities, and global civilizations. This realization changes how modern humans think about success in evolution itself. Modern societies often measure success through expansion, technological complexity, population growth, and environmental control. Yet the island humans survived for thousands of years without any of those things. They adapted closely to a small world surrounded by dangerous water and endured there far longer than many scientists once believed possible. Their existence suggests that survival in prehistory depended less on dominance than on fit between population and environment. A small isolated group could persist for immense periods if ecological balance remained stable enough. At the same time, the island story also reveals how fragile such balance always remains. Isolation protected the population while also trapping them within narrow survival margins. Once conditions shifted too far, adaptation itself may no longer have been enough. Scientists increasingly recognize that evolution does not move toward predetermined goals. There is no guaranteed direction leading automatically toward larger brains, more complex societies, or permanent survival. Evolution responds to local pressures in specific environments. Traits useful in one setting may become dangerous in another. The island humans appear to have adapted successfully to confined ecological conditions over many generations. Their bodies reflected reduced energy demands, limited territory, and long-term separation from continental migration systems. Modern humans survived along a different path shaped by mobility, larger population networks, and broader environmental flexibility. Neither outcome was guaranteed in advance. History remembers only the surviving branch because the others disappeared. The island population therefore forces modern people to confront the role of chance within human evolution. Geography mattered enormously. Deep ocean channels protected the population for thousands of years. Rising seas later increased ecological pressure. Volcanic instability reshaped the environment repeatedly. Small demographic changes may have carried consequences across generations within isolated communities. Modern humans survived not simply because of superiority, but because environmental and demographic conditions allowed survival to continue. Other branches of humanity disappeared under different combinations of pressure, isolation, and instability. This perspective softens the idea of human exceptionalism that often shapes modern thinking. Humanity becomes less like a single triumphant species and more like a fragile evolutionary family shaped unevenly by circumstance. The island humans also reveal how limited modern knowledge remains about deep prehistory. Scientists reconstructed their existence from only a handful of fossils and tools rescued from caves before tropical decay erased everything entirely. The overwhelming majority of their history remains unknown forever. Their languages, relationships, memories, fears, and ways of understanding the world disappeared almost completely. Only fragments survived long enough for modern discovery. This silence carries enormous weight because it reminds researchers that many other human populations may already be lost beyond recovery. The fossil record preserves only rare accidents of survival beneath specific environmental conditions. Entire human worlds may have vanished without leaving enough evidence to enter scientific understanding at all. In this sense, the island population represents both discovery and warning. They reveal how much human diversity once existed, while also revealing how little of that diversity modern people can still recover. The bones hidden beneath tropical stone changed science because they forced humanity to recognize that we were never alone in being human. For most of our evolutionary past, other forms of humanity existed beside us, adapting to their own landscapes and surviving within worlds now almost entirely erased by time. The island population survived quietly at the edge of that forgotten diversity until eventually even their memory disappeared beneath the Earth itself. Today, modern humans live in a world connected by satellites, oceans crossed in hours, and digital systems capable of preserving enormous amounts of information. Against that scale, the island population can seem impossibly distant and fragile. Yet their story continues to matter because it reveals something fundamental about humanity that modern civilization often forgets. Human beings were never separate from nature or protected from extinction by destiny alone. For most of prehistory, humanity existed as multiple vulnerable populations shaped constantly by geography, climate, isolation, and environmental change. Some branches survived longer than others. Some adapted successfully for thousands of years before disappearing completely. The island humans belonged to one of those branches. Their survival was remarkable, but it was never guaranteed. The island itself shaped both their endurance and their limits. Deep water protected them from many outside pressures while also reducing contact with larger human populations. Forests, caves, changing coastlines, and restricted resources created a world where survival depended on careful adaptation rather than expansion. Their bodies reflected those conditions. Their tools reflected those conditions. Even their eventual disappearance may have emerged from the same environmental balance that once protected them. The story therefore carries a quiet lesson about adaptation itself. Survival does not belong permanently to any species, population, or civilization. It depends on how closely living systems remain connected to the environments supporting them. Scientists studying the island population remain careful not to transform limited evidence into exaggerated conclusions. Much about their lives will never be known fully. Archaeology recovered fragments, not complete memory, yet even those fragments reveal enough to change how modern humans understand the past. The Earth was once inhabited by multiple forms of humanity, existing at the same time in different ecological worlds. Modern humans are the final surviving branch not because history moved inevitably toward us, but because countless fragile circumstances allowed our populations to continue while others disappeared. Geography, climate, migration, disease, isolation, and chance all shaped that outcome across immense stretches of time. The island humans remind us that extinction can happen quietly. A population may survive for thousands of years and still leave almost no permanent trace behind. Their disappearance was not recorded by kings, governments, or monuments. Forests covered their paths. Rising seas erased ancient coastlines. Tropical rain dissolved bone and memory together beneath the ground. Only much later did modern science uncover enough evidence to realize that another branch of humanity had once survived there almost until the edge of the modern world itself. This realization carries an unusual emotional weight. The island humans were not mythical creatures or fictional ancestors. They were part of the same larger human family that modern people belong to now. They adapted, struggled, survived environmental instability, and eventually disappeared within a changing world they could not fully control. Their story narrows the distance modern humans often place between themselves and the prehistoric past. Beneath technology and civilization, humanity remains biologically tied to environments that can still change beyond prediction or control. Perhaps this is the deepest meaning left behind by the island population. Human history is not only a story of progress, it is also a story of fragility, adaptation, and disappearance across deep time. Entire branches of humanity once existed beside us and vanished so completely that only fragments remained hidden underground. Modern humans survived, but survival alone should not create arrogance. The island humans remind us how narrow survival margins can become when environments shift and isolation grows too deep. Their rediscovery now offers something quieter than triumph. It offers perspective. Beneath modern civilization lies a much older human story shaped by uncertainty and loss as much as success. Somewhere inside that forgotten past, another kind of human once lived quietly on an island surrounded by rising seas and volcanic forests, surviving for thousands of years before disappearing almost without memory. And if so much of humanity's own past could vanish this completely, how much of ourselves do we still truly understand at all?